Faites l'appel, s'il vous plaît, Madame le greffier.
Monsieur le connétable de Saint-Hélier.
Présent.
Madame le connétable de Saint-Laurent.
Présente.
Monsieur le connétable de Saint-Brelard.
Présent.
Monsieur le connétable de la Trinité. Monsieur le connétable de Saint-Pierre.
Présent.
Madame le connétable de Saint-Martin.
Présent.
Monsieur le connétable de Saint-Jean.
Présent.
Monsieur le connétable de Saint-Clément.
Présent.
Monsieur le connétable de Grouville.
Présent.
Monsieur le connétable de Saint-Ouen. Monsieur le connétable de Saint-Marie.
Présent.
Monsieur le connétable de Saint-Sauveur.
Présent.
Monsieur le député Southern.
Enfin.
I'll take that as present. Monsieur le député Labbé. Oh, sorry, pardon. Madame le député Labbé.
Présente.
Monsieur le député Tadier.
Présent.
Monsieur le député Luce. Madame le député Dublé. Monsieur le député Morel.
Présent.
Madame le député Lehegera. Monsieur le député Ayer.
Présent.
Monsieur le député Ward.
Présent.
Madame le député Alves. Madame le député Gardner. Monsieur le député Gorse.
Présent.
Monsieur le député Farner.
Présent.
Madame le député Moore. Monsieur le député Mezek.
Présent.
Monsieur le député Balash.
Présent.
Monsieur le député Coles.
Présent.
Madame le député Corey.
Présente.
Monsieur le député Wall.
Présent.
Madame le député Miles.
Présente.
Madame le député Scott. Monsieur le député Renouf.
Présent.
Madame le député Curtis. Madame le député Feltham.
Présente.
Madame le député Binet.
Présente.
Madame le député Jeune.
Présente.
Madame le député Miller.
Présente.
Madame le député Howell.
Présente.
Monsieur le député Binet. Monsieur le député Ferry.
Présent.
Madame le député Kovac.
Présente.
Monsieur le député Curtis. Madame le député Ward.
Présente.
Madame le député Wilson.
Présente.
Madame le député Stevenson.
Présente.
Monsieur le député Andrews.
Madame le greffier.
Prions Dieu. Notre aide soit au nom de Dieu qui a fait les cieux et la terre. Amen. Seigneur Dieu, Père éternel et tout-puissant, qui a établi les gouvernements et les puissances de la terre pour le règlement et pour la conduite du peuple, et qui nous a commandé d'avoir toujours pour but la gloire de ton Saint-Nom. Nous te prions qu'il te plaise de donner à cette assemblée le don de conseil et de prudence, d'unir le cœur et les affections de tous ceux qui la composent, et de les conduire tellement toi-même par ton Saint-Esprit, que toute leur délibération étant accompagnée de ta bénédiction, réussisse au bien et au soulagement du peuple qui te plus de commettra le soin. Car nous t'en prions au nom et par le mérite de son Fils bien-aimé Jésus-Christ, notre Seigneur, qui nous a enseigné de t'invoquer en disant: Notre Père, qui es aux cieux, ton nom soit sanctifié, ton règne vienne, ta volonté soit faite sur la terre comme au ciel. Donne-nous aujourd'hui notre pain quotidien, et nous pardonne nos offenses, comme nous pardonnons à ceux qui nous ont offensés. Et ne nous induis point en tentation, mais délivre-nous du mal, car toi est la reine, la puissance et la gloire, au siècle des siècles. Amen. Monsieur le député Luce.
So Deputy Luce, I think if I recall from Friday evening, has got a medical appointment. Could he be excused, please?
Members content to mark the deputy excusing? Excusing.
Madame le député Dublé.
Présente.
Madame le député Alves.
Présente.
Madame le député Moore.
Defo.
Madame le député Scott.
Sir, Madame le Député Scott is unwell. Could I ask that she be declared malade?
Vous jurez que Madame le député Scott est tellement indisposée qu'elle ne peut pas assister aux états sans exposer sa santé.
Alad. Les États sont constitués.
So,
Deputy Gardner.
I would like to, Attorney, let you know that thank you for, sorry. As I found today that the health minister signed an order on Friday and coming into force today about £500 discharge, delayed discharge from the hospital, I have submitted urgent oral question, which I'm grateful that just been approved. I would like to ask to take it after lunch that everyone will have time to prepare.
All right, yes. Yes, Minister.
To say this in any event, I was going to ask if I could be excused this afternoon, as I have to fly to London to attend a medical appointment with a family member tomorrow morning. On that basis, I'm very happy to take the urgent oral question now. It's a straightforward answer, and I'm very happy to deal with it if members are at this point, sir.
Well, I was proposing to do it after the first debate, so members have see what the question is. So should we do it after the first debate, which will hopefully end before lunchtime? All right, you content with that? Yes, all right, we'll do that then. The next item is first-time buyer properties lodged by Deputy Alex Curtis, and the main respondent is the Minister for Housing. I ask the Secretary to read the proposition.
The States are asked to decide whether they are of opinion to request the Minister for Housing by 30th of September 2026, A, to compile and publish a register of all residential developments subject to first-time buyer or affordable ownership restrictions, and to update that register as further sites are identified. B, in consultation with the Minister for the Environment and the Minister for Treasury and Resources, to determine and publish for each site identified under A, the legal or planning mechanism through which restrictions are applied, and the conditions under which those restrictions may be varied or removed. And C, further to the work undertaken under A and B, to bring forward options for modifying ownership restrictions on existing developments, together with the implications for housing supply.
Deputy Alex Curtis.
Thank you, sir, and I thank members for their speeches on Friday. That saved me from the graveyard shift of debates at 5 o'clock. Sir, I would like to start, I'll start by acknowledging this is not one of the larger debates we have, and I'm sure it will be one of the quicker, but I think for those who it matters to, and to those who are planning policy in the future, it matters no less. I'll start with some questions, and members may know the answers to them. The first one is, how many homes do we have in Jersey? The answer to that, although it's hard to find an up-to-date one, is 48,610 private dwellings, including vacant dwellings, in the March 2021 census, plus whatever has been developed since, less whatever was on the sites that those were developed on. How many homes do we need? Well, the most recent modelling on that was in 2026 by Statistics Jersey, who assumed that households required 46,580 homes in 2025. So these are key numbers, and the projections behind them inform how we deliver new housing and how we consider existing housing. So my next question is, how many homes do we have that have restricted tenure, or first-time buyer restrictions, or shared equity? And this is where we run up against a blank wall. It's important that we have data when we move forward and make plans. It's important for those who live with assets that have restrictions on them that they know the lay of the land. And we're going to run up to a new set of island plan policies, a revised island plan. Indeed, we've just changed the planning and building law to allow for revisions. And it's fair to say that housing has typically been the key driver for plan revisions and new plans. And in recent years, the provision of new housing outside the built-up area has focused on affordable housing, or housing of a restricted tenure. So nonetheless, we don't know the numbers, and we're going to walk into policy making without the numbers. So members might be curious to have some ideas, and I hope those who read my report found it useful. I went through the records of at least new development since 1987, the island plan then, that lived until 2002. And I identified, and members will see the list of sites, anywhere between 1,820 and 2,274 homes provided with a first-time buyer or affordable purchase provision on it. These numbers don't include the many other sites that have been sold by Andium that were developed pre-then, members will know that sites like Clodagh have restrictions, Grasset Park, and many others around the island. So we have a measurable housing stock with restrictions, and we have an existing policy that defines first-time buyers, and our stock has a wide range of restrictions, from requiring first-time buyer status to requiring provision to be on the gateway. We have a wide and complex landscape, as the Minister acknowledges. At this point, members might want to know where this proposition comes from, and whilst it may come from my belief that good data is essential for good policy and good decision making, it actually comes from islanders who contacted me some time ago, who own and occupy first-time buyer sites and believe that the current landscape needs to be reviewed. We have entire estates with large amounts of first-time buyer and islanders who bought at the same time. We are seeing demographic changes on these sites. Their family circumstances have changed, and many times for the better. They raised their families in homes of a certain size, and they don't need the size of property anymore. But what they have found, and what many have found, and they've contacted me, especially following the lodging of this, is that the market isn't responding to their desire to sell and to release a home, that the conditions perhaps attached are not the right mechanism to restrict tenure anymore. And that is somewhat shown out through the fact that we don't provide much first-time buyer restricted housing without a shared equity product. As those members will have read in my report, most of the housing on the market now that has a first-time buyer provision has that, but has nothing to deflate or to suppress the market value of that. These are market value properties often listed around circa £700,000, £650,000, but have a restricted audience as to who can buy them. And we may wish to ask, is our audience the right one? So it comes from that position, and I should really sum up what this proposition does, because when I read the Minister's comments, it's safe to say they are what I call a soft objection. It doesn't feel like I'm going to have a lot of pushback against the idea, just the implementation. So I want to reassure members that Part A is a simple item to accept. Part A says that we should have a register of all residential developments subject to such restrictions, first-time buyer and affordable housing. In the Minister's comments, he agrees. He says, I've already commissioned this work, and a consolidated register of restricted tenure sites is being prepared. He recognises the value of this in saying a register of this kind will enable buyers, sellers, legal professionals and government officers to more easily understand site-specific restrictions, support faster and more consistent decision-making, and provide a clearer picture of the island's restricted tenure housing stock. You can imagine, sir, if I read up to there, I thought I was onto a winner. Except the next line says, I am not, however, in a position to commit to a publication date. And that is disappointing, because what gets measured, sir, gets done. And in this case, we have a data set recognised by the Minister, recognised by many to be of value for current policy and for future planning, and yet it is not ready to work on. And I think one of the fears or challenges here that I hope to at least persuade a few members on is that I'm not asking for a complete list to be published by September 2026. The Minister quite rightly highlights that the information spans decades of planning decisions, legal agreement and archived records. However, the wording of the proposition identifies that such a register should be updated as sites are identified. It is made and written in such a way to say that whilst we do need a register of all of these, it says that they are to be updated as identified. Because my fear and my concern to the Minister is if perfect is the answer in this, if every single sale of Andean that had a condition, every site with 3 houses with these, the Minister will not publish this in 2026, he will not publish this in 2027, nor 2028. His identification that some of these sites are complex and will only come out of the woodwork far later is accurate. But we have to start somewhere. And I think we start by actually putting into gear the wheels of motion that publish a register and show that it is actively being worked on. And we can bring the public with that. That could easily work by saying, filling in the register from most recent to furthest back, and actually saying to quality assure everything from 2000 onwards or not. It doesn't cut the mustard to say that it's too hard to start by September 2026 and start publishing. Part B is to focus on publishing the legal and planning mechanisms through which restrictions are applied and conditions under which these may be varied or removed. And this is a corollary, really, to part A, which is if a site is restricted and we know where the site is, we should know what the restriction is. The Minister, in his comments, says that this would be, in essence, a form of duplication, and any attempt to summarise, reinterpret or determine these mechanisms would be misconstrued. Well, I would agree we should not summarise or rewrite these, but what we should do is at least upload digital copies of these alongside the sites. Members will know that most planning obligation agreements are online, but not all planning applications. They mostly go from 2012 onwards when they were digitised. So whilst I agree we should point to the relevant data set, it should at least be accessible to the general public alongside that file in the register. So his view that we point to it is accurate. The data needs to be digital and accessible for those to use it. So I hope, again, members can see this is not a case of bureaucracy writing, it's just about collating and ensuring the information's there. And now part C is the ambitious one, and I don't expect all members to support here, given the timeline. But this is a fact that if we have the data and we know where our housing sites are and how they are controlled, it is useful to know how we can use that data to affect new policy. Should we then look at the definition of a first-time buyer? Should we look at the occupant of a first-time buyer of a 4-bed house? At the moment, we have restrictions on these. If somebody owns an open market 1-bedroom flat, if they wish to buy a 4-bedroom house, they can do so if it is a first-time buyer, but only under an exemption in which they sell their flat to a first-time buyer. And I think the reality of that policy is a challenging one, and one we may wish to review. So, sir, that's it. 3 simple parts. Part A, to get the register published and to keep the work going that the Minister says. As I say, the Part A says to update it where we identify new sites, ones that come out of the woodwork, those old kind of developments where documentation, understandably, is of poorer quality. Part B, the corollary says, well, we have the sites, we now need to know what the conditions were. There's no point keeping that in Jersey Archive. Let's scan it, let's put it in the same place and allow decision makers to read it. And Part C might push against the timetables and says, well, we've got the data, what shall we do with it? So I think it's quite a simple thing, and there is no technical or practical reason why Part A or Part B couldn't start to be implemented. It's a simple ask. It's one that will help homeowners make their case to the Minister, allow the island better data decision making, and I really have no more to say on it. It's quite simple. What I will say is I completely understand concern or thinking there's a lot of work in accepting Part C, and this is another review. I could even accept an argument on Part B, so I ask members to consider that it will be taken in parts, and I certainly ask at least Part A is supported today, and I make the proposition.
Thank you, Deputy. Is the proposition seconded? Yes, sir. Thank you. Does anyone speak on the proposition? Minister.
Thank you, sir. Deputy Alex Curtis describes the comments that I've published in response to this proposition as reading a bit like a soft objection. I'm sorry to disappoint him on a Monday morning, but it's actually probably a little bit harsher than that. I think centrally for these 2 reasons. The first, sir, is that the Deputy is asking for a quantum of work to be done by a specific date that I simply cannot accept as realistic, and don't think that it can be done because of the complex nature behind each part of these, not even just them all in total, but each part of them, I simply don't think is feasible to have done by the end of the 30th, or the end of September 2026. But also, sir, a second objection to it is that I think some of what it asks us to do is not a good idea and shouldn't be done. So, Deputy Curtis, in relation to the first part of this proposition, which is in some senses the easy bit, because it's just finding information that's out there and publishing it, he suggested that it could be half done by the 30th of September and then update it as we go along from there. But I have to say that's not my reading of the proposition, because that Part A asks to compile and publish a register of all residential developments subject to first-time buyer or affordable ownership restrictions, not some of them. It is asking for that total amount of work to be done by the 30th of September. And when it goes on to say, and to update that register as further sites are identified, I read that as updating it if you realised you missed something in your first proper attempt, or if further sites are created that have first-time buyer restrictions. So his reading of that is not the same as mine. And so I don't think that it is possible to do all of that work by the end of September, because there are lots of housing sites with restrictions on them. They have all arisen at completely different times in history where the rules do vary quite significantly, and the founding documents for those sites and outlining their restrictions are found in all sorts of different ways and places, and it is not simply going to some existing database and finding it all. It is a lot more complex than that. But so that work will happen. That is something that was already underway. It's not a simple thing to do, and it won't be done by the end of September, but it will be done at some point, so that piece of work will happen, but not to the timetable that Deputy Alex Curtis is asking for. That the Deputy's Part B then asks us to, in consultation with the Environment Minister and Treasury Minister, to determine and publish for each site identified under A the legal or planning mechanism through which restrictions are applied and the conditions under which those restrictions may be varied and removed. Well, sir, the documents that outline what those restrictions are and how they might be varied or removed, again, are spread over lots of different documents established at lots of different points in history, and acquiring them is not that simple. That will take a significant amount of time. And in any event, sir, I don't think that it's right that the government should publish anything really that's separate to those documents that tries to summarise or paraphrase what those restrictions are or the mechanisms for having them removed. The only documents that should be relied upon for that information are those founding documents, like the planning obligation agreements or deeds or anything else that contributes to that, and government can signpost to those, and that may well be part of what happens in the overall register at the end, but it shouldn't itself provide its own interpretation of that information, because that could be risked as being seen as legal advice or something that sellers or buyers should be relying on, when it shouldn't be, because that iteration of that information would not have legal force. It's only those founding documents, and that is the sort of thing they should be looking at anyway when they're looking at selling. That should be something that they're looking for anyway, irrespective of this proposition. So it's not of any particular value for the government to be providing its own kind of demonstration of that information. And I would say it's a bad idea, and that's another reason why Part B should be rejected. And Part C as well, we ask to reject. I have to push back a bit at some of the comments made in the Deputy's report and his explanation about current housing conditions and the difficulties that they cause some people, because it's not just first-time buyer restricted properties that we're seeing a lower turnover than we've seen in recent years. It's properties across all different kinds in the islands that we're seeing that. It's not a unique thing just for first-time buyer restricted properties, and I worry that if we accept that point at the outset and suggest that the solution is to take homes that were created for to be enjoyed not just by those first purchasers but by future generations of purchasers, and undo the work that was done at the time those housing sites were created, that we risk throwing the baby out with the bathwater and losing protections in those homes that we would end up never getting back if we establish a framework for dismantling them and undoing the work that was done at the time that they were created. And I think that there are two better alternatives for this other than what Deputy Alex Curtis proposes in Part C. The first, sir, is that the Minister for Housing does have a reasonable amount of discretion as to who can qualify as a first-time buyer and who can have access to homes that have restrictions on them. And in my tenure as Housing Minister, I have made changes to that have made things a bit easier for people, in particular those looking to upsize and for people looking to regain first-time buyer status as they're moving up the chain, and that's helped a bit. I am persuaded that there's more that needs to be done on that, and when the Chief Minister published the Investing in Jersey plan, there was a specific part in that said that we would look at first-time buyer rules and products, and that is something that I've been working on. And I'm hoping, sir, that before my last opportunity in this term of office to make some further modest revisions to the first-time buyer rules, that in particular, sir, will allow them to work better with downsizing policies. That's something that we've made a lot of progress on in this term, and Deputy Tom Coles was one of those who helped put that on the agenda. Creating a better synergy between those two policies that finds people who are looking to upsize and people who are looking to downsize. Well, if you can get those two policies working together, you can get that movement and you can help both people in those instances. So there are elements to my discretion on the first-time buyer rules that I'm hoping to sign off before the end of this term that will create those better synergies between those two. And also, sir, for people who are looking for, who are neither upsizing nor downsizing, but looking for a lateral move, they might find a home of the equivalent size that they already own that is just better or more suitable for their needs for whatever reason. It might be location or other kind of amenity that's nearby. So before the end of this term of office, I should be able to do some of that, which will help and will, I think, assist those who might find themselves unduly restrained by those current first-time buyer policies. And that's, I think, a little bit in line with the philosophy underpinning what Deputy Alex Curtis is trying to do here. But I think it would be more suitable for this rather than going back and looking to overturn things that were set in place a long time ago to provide an in perpetuity benefit over time. And of course, there will, in the next term of office, need to be a new island plan. That will be a very comprehensive process. It will be evidence-based. There will be lots of data and examinations of all these things underpinning it. And I think for the next stage of lots of this, that is a much better place to be looking at to address those policies rather than taking the options that Deputy Curtis has proposed in this proposition. So, sir, I do ask that members reject all parts of this proposition. Part B, because I don't think it's a sensible thing for government to be doing. Part C, because it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And Part A, because it is already being done, but not to the deadline that the Deputy proposes. And the very final point I'll make, sir, is that I do think there is a genuine risk that with the number of propositions that have already been agreed to set the agenda for housing policy over the next year, so going over PERDA, over the election and to the beginning of the tenure of the next housing minister, we're getting to a point where all that space and time is being taken up by those propositions, which actually means there is a risk that the next housing minister is hamstrung by decisions of an outgoing assembly on things like the review of the process for buying homes, the empty property stuff, and now potentially this, putting a register together, which, though it's a good idea, I wouldn't say that compiling a register is the kind of emergency action response that you would want when public have given you a mandate for change. That's something that you can and should take time with and not put aside more important work to focus on that instead. So for those reasons, that some of what's in the proposition I contend is not the best thing to do, and the fact that this would not be able to be achieved within the time frame that the Deputy proposes without severely hamstringing the next minister and, you know, basically making the first year maybe of their appointment futile because they won't really have capacity to undertake their own agenda. I ask the Assembly to reject all parts of the proposition.
Thank you, Minister. Does anyone else wish to speak on this proposition? If no one else wishes to speak, Deputy Hall.
think we described this game of chicken the other day, didn't we, with all these speeches. So this is an eminently sensible proposition brought forward by Deputy Alex Curtis because it's looking for data. Isn't that a handy idea? It's a great idea. So we're being asked today to consider a proposition that on the surface appears administrative, a register, a review, and a set of options. But beneath that surface lies something far more important. This is a debate about stewardship. It is a debate about intergenerational fairness, and it is a debate about the integrity of the commitments this island has made to its people over many decades. Because the homes covered by first-time buyer and affordable ownership restrictions are not simply units in a market, they are part of Jersey's social infrastructure. They were created because the market alone could not deliver fairness. They were created to give ordinary families a foothold, and they were created as a promise that some homes would remain accessible to those who would otherwise be priced out. That promise is not a technicality, it is a social contract. And like any social contract, it must be looked after and attention paid to it. Parts A and B of this proposition asks us to do something very simple and very overdue, to understand what we have inherited. We cannot steward what we cannot see. We cannot protect what we do not fully understand. And we cannot take responsible decisions about the future if we do not have clarity about the past. A register of restricted ownership developments is not bureaucracy. It is the minimum standard of responsible guardianship. Mapping the legal mechanisms behind those restrictions is not optional. It is the foundation on which any future policy must rest. This is the work of stewardship, the quiet, careful work of understanding the assets we hold in trust for the public. But members, let's be honest with ourselves. The most sensitive part of this proposition is not the register, it is not the legal mapping, it is part C, the request to bring forward options for modifying restrictions. This is where the debate moves from transparency to judgment. Because once we have a clear picture of the landscape, there will inevitably be pressure to tidy up inconsistencies. And tidying up can be a dangerous phrase in public policy. It can become a euphemism for loosening restrictions, for eroding affordability, for turning long-standing commitments into negotiable conveniences. That may feel administratively neat, but it risks creating windfall gains for some at the expense of future generations. It risks weakening the very mechanisms that were designed to protect fairness. And it risks breaking faith with the people who believed that these homes would remain accessible, not just for them, but for those who came after. Intergenerational fairness demands that we resist that temptation. Some schemes are outdated. Some mechanisms are inconsistent. Some restrictions may need modernizing to reflect today's reality. There is nothing wrong with reform, provided it strengthens rather than weakens the long-term public interest. The question before us is not whether change is possible. The question before us is not whether change is possible. The question is whether change will honor the intention behind these schemes or undermine it. Will we use the new clarity to reinforce fairness or to dilute it? Will we protect the next generation's chance to own a home, or will we narrow it? Will we act as custodians or as short-term managers? These are the questions that will define the legacy of this work. We are not the owners of these policies, we are their custodians. We hold them for a time and then we pass them on. The decision we make today will shape who gets a chance tomorrow. So yes, let us support the creation of a register. Yes, let us understand the legal mechanisms that underpin these restrictions, but let us also be clear that transparency is neutral. while what we do with it is not. The real test of stewardship will come when we are asked to consider the options that emerge from this work. And when that moment comes, we must ensure that our decisions protect the integrity of the social contract that previous generations built, and that future generations will depend upon. Because fairness is not something we inherit, it is something we choose to uphold. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Breniff.
Thank you, sir. I have a far more narrow speech to make, which focuses on, I think, the main point of disagreement, if you like, that I can see here, which is about Part A and the timing. The Deputy Mezek, the Housing Minister, has said that he is supportive of the main aim. He just doesn't think it's feasible in the time with regard to Part A. So I think we agree we have to start somewhere. He says the work has already started. In terms of a deadline and whether you can meet it or not, I think we are very familiar in this assembly with deadlines slipping. We are also familiar with the concept that you can produce a report that presents as much information as you've been able to gather in the time available, along with an explanatory note that explains why you may not have been able to do absolutely everything that would be required. That seems to me to be a perfectly normal response to a deadline being imposed that you do your best to meet, and you produce as much good information as you can within that time. So I think the objection that the deadline for Part A is just too tight on the grounds that it's impossible to gather all the information in that time is not really a fundamental reason for not voting for Part A. The Minister has also said that there are some elements of it that may not be, that timetable isn't realistic, as I say, because of the time. But the Minister may not have heard of my very best friend, Claude. My best friend, Claude, is an AI bot that is able to help with various queries of this nature. And it is not that hard to ask an AI agent to begin examining data sets for you. I imagine it's already going on in government, one would hope so. But planning obligation agreements can be trawled with the use of an AI engine to find a summary of all the things that fall within certain criteria. I wonder if it's actually been tried on this data set, if the work is already underway. It seems to me that we perhaps should shift gear in the way that we approach something of this type. And I think the other point that's missing here is the Minister has said that, it will take a long time, and the better response to this would be to think of it in planning terms around the next island plan. But of course, decision makers are having to make decisions all the time in planning terms. And two of the key things they're having to decide are around first-time buyer homes and affordable homes. Those are decisions that are having to be made all the time by planning officers and by the planning committee when planning applications get to them. What is the appropriate level to set for things around those two demands? And of course, it's very hard to know exactly what criteria you should be setting around planning applications if you don't know exactly what your current situation is. How much need is currently already met? How much need currently remains? And so this register of data that would enable enable decision makers to make those decisions with just a little bit more clarity around the actual situation, as opposed to the finger in the air, or this is what it was last time we looked, or whatever. So I think that it is wrong to say that we should just hang on until the next island plan is put together. which we do not know when it will be. You know, if we introduce the ability to amend an island plan, then we may sit through another entire assembly without producing another full island plan. We might simply choose, the next assembly might simply choose to amend rather than produce a new one. So I think for those reasons, this data set feels very, very important. And I would also say that the Minister's argument is slightly undermined. He says that this would tie up his department and hamstring, mean that his successor would be hamstrung in the role because all the resource is already bagged by previous competing requirements. But of course he says the work's already underway. So if it's already underway, what's to stop it just being, you know, tweaked up a little bit? We can't be so close to capacity within his department that a little tweak on this would mean that he had nothing left. His department had nothing left. So I think that the Deputy Curtis, Alex Curtis, has identified a significant area of housing policy that we all care about deeply and worry about as part of the housing crisis. I wonder if if some rebuttal arguments are being prepared. So a significant area of policy has been identified. It's an area where everyone acknowledges, including the Minister, that we have some gaps. It's an area where the Minister says the work is already underway, and his only reason for not meeting the deadline is he says it would be difficult to meet the deadline because it would tie up too much resource, even though he's already underway doing it. I think there's a pragmatic, easy way to approve Part A, which would simply mean that he did as much work as, his successor minister did as much work as they reasonably could by the deadline, and either then suggested a delay or published what they had and updated as they went along. Doesn't seem that difficult to me, so I shall certainly be supporting Part A.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Balash.
So Deputy Renouf has covered a little much, to an extent, the ground that I was intending to cover myself, so I will be brief. I understand the Minister's arguments in relation to paragraphs B and C, and it may be that they are premature, but I really can't see any reason not to support paragraph A. State-loan properties used to have no restrictions, and the consequence was that on resale, the market would have taken the value beyond the reach of first-time buyers. And so legally enforceable restrictions were introduced. But they have been introduced in a number of different ways. And frankly, we are in a bit of a muddle if we don't know exactly what the position is now. And as with every interference with the market, there are unforeseen consequences. If the price is fixed at the level of first-time buyers, the market value of the property may well be higher, and potential sellers may find themselves stuck. They may want to move up market, but if they can't achieve the market value of their property, then they can't afford to do so. And that may be a price that we have to pay. But the first stage is surely to find out what the position is. If it was not possible to do it by the 30th of September, it's disappointing that the Minister didn't lodge an amendment to make it the 31st of December, or whatever is the appropriate date. But for my part, I can't see any good reason why in 6 months' time, if the work has already started, it should not be completed. We are about to enter a sort of policy vacuum during PERDA when no new policies can be introduced, and civil servants ought to be a little more able to carry out work of this kind. So I can't think of any good reason why we shouldn't vote for paragraph A.
Thank you, Deputy. Minister for Treasury and Resources.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I would like to address Part B of the proposition in particular and emphasise the issues that it would create. While work is already underway on Part A to compile a register, members should not underestimate the scale of that task. It involves reviewing decades of planning decisions and legal agreements, and that is a truly mammoth undertaking. Part B would extend this workload significantly. It is not a little tweak. It requires publishing for every existing first-time buyer property the specific legal or planning mechanism through which the restriction was applied, along with the conditions under which it could be varied or removed. In practical terms, that means that in all likelihood, a property lawyer would need to review the original source documents for every single designated property. I'm not sure how long it would take, I'm sure Deputy Curtis would have a view, how long it would take to programme an AI bot to do that work, which involves a level of technical analysis, and some of which, if they are more than, 10 years ago, those documents will be in French. So we need a bilingual bot who can deal with conveyancing French to work its way through some of these challenges. It may be that asking officers to plough through property documents in French is a bit above and beyond what they are normally engaged to do. Consequently, sir, this exercise will take months, if not years, and I struggle to see what benefit it would deliver. In any property transaction in future, the parties' lawyers will always want to examine the full source documentation. They are very unlikely to rely on a summary provided in a register unless that register was fully verified and they were protected from errors in it. More broadly, the Minister for Housing is right to highlight the considerable burden that the proposition as a whole would place on the already limited resources of the housing policy team. One might argue that those resources are better placed examining real policy developments that will make a difference to the housing market in Jersey and not in simple administrative tasks of bringing together a register at speed for really little benefit. It goes without saying, therefore, that this could also lead to considerable unanticipated cost and liability for government, even if we were perhaps to engage the property lawyers in Law Officers Department, who I am sure are themselves already busy. Deputy Renouf suggests that we can just do what we can in the time available, publish what we can in the time available, and all will be well. We all know exactly how much criticism the Minister would face if he produced an incomplete work and said, well, I've done my best, but this is all I can give you. He would be absolutely vilified by this Assembly, and we all know that. So I think it's unfair to set a deadline that we know we cannot meet. It would put the Minister or the future Minister under pressure that is simply not fair. So, sir, for these reasons, I would ask members to reject the proposition. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Does anyone else to speak on the proposition? If no one else wishes to speak, I call upon Deputy Curtis to reply.
Thank you, sir, and I thank those who spoke. Working backwards, the Minister for Treasury and Resources speech there could be almost titled "Reasons to Say No," but I have to say there's a few things I want to pull apart in this. Working right back from the last part, that actually publishing incomplete work would receive a challenge or kind of, I think that's a really sad place to position us in. And I see the Minister saying it would. Well, that's a culture change. That is one of the most important things we have to accept as a government, as an assembly, is to actually get our work out there in the public, get the island knowing what's going on, and for a bit take a bit of the abuse that we might get from the Facebook naysayers. But at the end of the day, perfect is the enemy of progress and good. And I think we have a fear and an aversion to actually saying, look, work is being done. And to the work is being done element, which I'll touch on briefly in just a minute, I couldn't help think of the kind of the analogy or the scenario we often find ourselves in life in, sir, which is you're working on a piece of work, it might be a desk-based piece of work, and somebody's pushing you who doesn't need the work, but would quite like to know how you're getting on. They say, how's it going? They go, oh, you know, I've done the first 2 chapters, or I'm writing a book, it's going really well, I'm working towards it. In all reality, almost no work may have been done, and they ask you again, and you feel a little kind of backed into a corner, because you really should have made progress in the last week. And they say, how's it going? Oh, yeah, you know what, I've really refined my arguments on this, I'm working on the conclusion. The reality is maybe nothing's changed in the background. And then they say to you, oh, brilliant, well, share your draft, whatever state it's in. And immediately, your face drops and you go, well, I can't say the words you might say, because they've caught you out. When actually, sometimes the best working practices are those where you work in the open, and you work and you say, well, look, actually, I'm really struggling on this and I can't move forward. Here is where I'm at. And I smile and I see other members smiling because they or their family members or their work colleagues have been in that situation. You always say the work's ongoing, but actually it requires a bit of scrutiny from your friends, from your families, from your colleagues, to actually get that work in train. And that's what's really important about Part A, getting the work in train and getting people knowing it in train. At this point, I will quickly deal with the comments about the wording of the proposition. And it's one where almost I feel, you know, you can't win with a proposition wording. I considered the fact that it would be unfeasible to publish an entire list to start with. And the original wording pre-amendment by those who support members in amending for publication said to publish a register of all sites known to have restrictions and then further sites identified. And I think it was felt that, well, the fact that I've said further sites as identified clarifies that not everything is known right now. So we entered almost a kind of a debate about the linguistics. Sites to be identified is not about changes or new things. It's about where a site is identified where it wasn't known. And it is, in my view, perfectly legitimate to consider that we can publish a list, and as we identify more, we can go along. Other points to make, I would say that when it comes to Part B, and I can sense the mood on Part B, but I think at Part A I would really like to see members support the discussion of property lawyers having to search for the clause and stuff. You can interpret Part B in many ways, so, and the way I meant it to be read is, well, look, this restriction is provided by way of property contract. This restriction is provided by way of planning obligation agreement. This restriction is controlled under the statutory powers of the planning law under a condition. It doesn't require a lawyer to tell you that the condition lives within a certain statutory document. And if it's felt to, I see faces across the room, if it's felt hard to explain how to change that, what I really meant to say was we may have many of these governed by definition within the property contract. Many of these properties don't have it within the property contract. It may be within a planning obligation agreement, but not the contract of property. And some it will be on the condition of the approval of planning. Knowing where they are, it's as simple perhaps to say as one must modify the property contract, one must amend in the Royal Court the planning obligation agreement, and one doesn't need to go any further than that actually then as to specify the statutory method in which one addresses it. I think the comments made about waiting to the island plan is correct. This is a piece of work that has to be ongoing. I've made the case, sir, that the best way to get this work to keep going and progress to be made is for it to be published. I hope my analogy is clear to members that it would be better to publish in September. I would say it's, you know, as somebody who's seen probably dozens of amendments from ministers that change timelines to the ones they think is appropriate, and it's considered work's ongoing, work's underway, but the timeline's unfeasible. If the objection to Part A was that, knowing this was split in 3 parts, it's disappointing to see that a timeline wasn't put. And maybe that comes down to the fact that there is a fear that there will never be a perfect time to publish. It will be hard to compile this data. And I think the comments made that we could be an entire assembly away, we could go through 4 more years and still not have a register, is a legitimate position to find ourselves in. We are, sir, 4 years on from when I think it was Deputy Higgins, or 5 years on, brought one for commercial and residential properties. We've gone through the 4 years. We know the cycle if we don't get the work done. And we know that actually the data is important for making policy here and into the future. So I think I've made my case. I urge members to support Part A. I would be clear to you, sir, that the reading is as sites are identified means that where a site is not known to have conditions or where the condition is not found, that may be added after September. And the reality of decisions made in this assembly, sir, is that if it can't be done in a time, it doesn't seem to get done in the time, but at least it holds feet to the flames. So with that, sir, I ask for a vote in 3 parts, obviously starting on Part A, and I call for the appel.
Thank you, Deputy. The appel has been called for. Members are invited to return to their seats. I ask the greffier to open the voting on Part A. All members have the opportunity of casting their votes. I ask the greffier to close the voting. I can announce that Part A has been narrowly rejected. 19 votes pour, 21 votes contre. Accordingly, parts B and C fall away. Now come to an urgent oral question that Deputy Gardner will put to the Minister of Health and Social Services. Deputy Gardner.
Thank you, sir. Will the Minister advise why a policy change introducing charges of over £500 per day for islanders remaining in hospital after being declared fit for discharge was brought into force by ministerial order without prior assembly scrutiny or public awareness, and what assessment has been made of its impact on patients and families?
Minister.
Sir, there's a number of points I think I need to make to clarify the situation. This issue has been in the public domain for a number of months. It was on the Health Advisory Board's recent agenda earlier in the year, and it has their full approval. I'd make it very, very plain that it's not a charge for healthcare, it's actually a charge for accommodation and food. When a patient has been deemed fit to be discharged and suitable accommodation and care package has been arranged for them, the charge would be introduced. But I make the point again that this has been very deemed, I think, generous in my view, that they've got 5 days grace before the charge is implemented. It's important for members to know that last year we lost 1,000 bed nights from people choosing not to take up the arrangements that have been made for them. And perhaps it's just me, but if anybody thinks it's more important to keep people in hospital sometimes for up to a month occupying a hospital bed while we've got people at home in pain waiting for an operation, I'm afraid their thinking doesn't accord with mine, sir. I think that hopefully that will cover it, sir. And the reason I introduced it by order is because I didn't think on something as sensible as this it was worth wasting a huge amount of everybody else's time. The Assembly gives me the powers to make these orders, and I thought it was highly appropriate to do so, sir. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Minister, for clarifying this. This policy was to address delay of discharge due to the bed blocking. What evidence he has that delays are primarily due to the patient choice rather than a lack of staff and care capacity in the community?
Minister.
I'll repeat, sir, that the arrangements have been made, and there is a place for these people to go to. There's no doubt about it. We're not asking them to go to somewhere where there hasn't been an appropriate arrangement made. It's very often the case that people don't want to go and spend their time in a care home that isn't the one of their choice while they wait to get the one of their choice. They feel it's simpler to stay in a hospital bed. I'm afraid if we had a surplus of hospital beds and a surplus of money, it perhaps wouldn't matter, but we're short of hospital beds and people are at home in pain waiting for operations. So I make no excuse for this, and in fact, I think it's the right thing to have done.
Deputy Renouf.
Thank you, sir. Can the Minister just confirm then that the decision about whether an appropriate place is available will be one entirely made by medical staff and won't involve any consultation with the patient about, for example, whether that it is appropriate for their needs in terms of what they consider to be their needs around, say, transport of relatives and so on.
Minister.
So there's a whole process that takes place. I haven't got access to it at the moment. I'm very happy to find out what that process is and to let the deputy know, sir. But you can rest assured people aren't being put in harm's way. Arrangements are being made for them to be properly cared for. As I say, it may be a difference of opinion. Perhaps people think it is better for people to stay and occupy a hospital bed for up to a month while other people are waiting at home in pain. Maybe we just put it down to a matter of opinion, so it's not my opinion. Thank you.
Supplementary?
Yes, so I'm simply trying to understand how the policy works in practice. I think the question I would ask to narrow it down is, does the patient have any say at all in the defining of what constitutes an adequate care package for them, which they would have to accept or face the charges?
Minister.
All I can say is that I haven't had any, in the 2 years I've been here, I haven't had any instances of it being otherwise. So I'm happy to make inquiries and I'm happy to let the deputy know, as I say, what the procedure is. I can't quote it offhand, but I'm certain, as I say, I'm sure we're not putting people into awkward or dangerous situations. So.
Deputy Stevenson.
Thank you, sir. The charges for overstaying were announced and I think went to the Health Advisory Board as part of a package of changes in charging policies at health designed to change behaviours and save money. Does the Minister intend to sign any further orders or take any further action before the election relating to any of those other measures within that package? Specifically, I'm thinking of proposals to charge some islanders for medical travel.
Minister.
We've considered the medical travel issue, and given the amount of angst that it's caused and the relatively small amount of money, we're not going to take any further action. It will remain open for review for whoever the next health minister is, but we're not taking action on that. We are going to introduce eligibility criteria for people coming from areas where they should have health insurance. At the moment, very often we treat people with it for emergency care from those places, and we simply aren't able to access the insurance money because the insurance company tell us that we have a policy of free treatment for everybody. So we're going to introduce that so that we can have access to people's travel insurance money if they have emergency care. So.
Supplementary?
Yes, thank you, sir, and I'm very pleased to hear the decision that's been reached on the travel there. What work is being undertaken as part of the charges that are being introduced to address any of the root causes of overstaying in hospital, not just bringing in new charges to try to deal with it? Thank you.
Minister.
Well, if I understand what I'm being told correctly, the root cause is people. This is a small number of people who just want to go to the care home of their choice. I think, relatively speaking, it's as simple as that. I don't think there are any other major complications. As I say, if we had more hospital beds and more money, it might be a different story. But as everybody knows, until we've got the new hospital built, there is a desperate bed shortage. So.
Deputy Doublé.
Thank you, sir. The Minister mentioned the Health Board, and I note in the minutes of that meeting, the Board have recommended that individual cases are handled sensitively. Can the Minister advise what that might look like where a patient if they're unable to pay, or if they have reasons for needing to stay that perhaps fall outside what the Minister has planned for?
Minister.
My understanding is this takes place already, sir. If anybody's reporting special circumstances, it usually goes to the executive leadership team for consideration. So I think those things, as I said before, I don't think people are being badly treated in this instance in any way, sir.
Supplementary? So the questions from the Connaught Iveson Brallard, then Deputy Miles, then final supplementary from Deputy Gardner. Connaught Iveson Brallard.
Thank you, sir. And whilst I support the Minister's proposals, his orders, proposed orders, I would just ask to counsel care in the consequences of a patient being asked to leave. That's probably the wrong terminology, being asked to leave the hospital. My experience, sir, is that sometimes a patient may not be in a position either mentally, physically, to be able to judge what's happening to them. So it does fall back to the family to deal with. And that those patients may suddenly find themselves in, or the family may find themselves in a position whereby they're faced with a charge which perhaps they weren't expecting. So I would simply ask him to, his team, to consider the consequences of any decisions that are made for a particular patient. Thank you, sir.
Minister.
Can't really comment on that other than to say that I hear what the Council was saying, and I think those considerations are taken into account already, sir. And I'm led to believe there is an appeals process. So if the family or the patient aren't happy, they can appeal.
Deputy Miles.
Thank you, sir. I'm actually disappointed that the Minister cannot articulate the process that is undertaken to ensure that a suitable care package is in place for every patient. Can the Minister assure the Assembly that there is sufficient capacity within his social work service to ensure that every patient has a proper assessment before they're discharged from hospital? Thank you, sir.
Minister.
I don't have any evidence to the contrary, sir. So I think it's safe to assume that is the case. I know people might be disappointed, but I've got the awkward job of having justified taking £24 million extra money from the budget ongoing, sir. So it's important that our money is well spent. And yeah, there are a number of things that need to be done in health. We've started to do them, and there are more to come, because we have a more and more complex service that requires more and more money. And we have to make better efforts to make sure that the money is spent properly. And I say for that, I make no apologies, sir.
Supplementary.
Thank you, sir. Can the Minister explain why he hasn't satisfied himself of these important issues before he signed the order?
That's it's because it's an organisation of 3,000 people. I've run a reasonably sizable organisation myself, as it happens. And when you're in that position, you learn to trust people. And we've got, I think, a pretty first-rate team of people running the organisation now. And there are a whole range of areas where I have to trust what I'm being told by people every day of the week, sir. So that's the way that's my experience of how these things work, sir.
Final supplementary, Deputy Gardner.
Thank you, sir. And in the context of the cost of living, does the Minister accept that these charges risk penalise patients for system failures? And given the advisory board reference for debt collection and administrative charges, would he confirm whether the Council of Ministers considered this policy and whether supported evidences and advice would be published? So,
Minister.
Sorry, there were a number of questions there. I was trying to take them in, and I do apologise to the Deputy, but if she could repeat them, I'll just try and take some notes as we go.
Yes, Deputy.
So does Minister think there is a risk to penalise the patient? The advisory, what he has done with advisory board reference to debt collection, and he can confirm was it discussed with this Council of Ministers, and if it will be published, the evidence will be published.
The issue of charges was discussed with the Council of Ministers. It was a courtesy matter. I don't intend to publish anything. I've been given permission by this Assembly to take these decisions, and take them I will. I don't think there's any risk to patients at all, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Now I'll move back to the next item to debate, which is statutory duty to future generations, lodged by Deputy Wilson. The main respondent is the Chief Minister. May I ask the Greffier to read the proposition?
The States are asked to decide whether they are of opinion that it should be a statutory duty of the Council of Ministers to consider the impact of policy making and law drafting on future generations, and to request the Chief Minister to undertake all necessary actions to implement a law setting out the government's duty to future generations, such law to have regard to A, avoiding decisions that create unsustainable debt burdens on future generations so they can sustain economic well-being and prudent management of the island's finances. B, preserving and protecting the natural environment from irreversible damage to enable future generations' enjoyment of the island and its surroundings. C, reinvigorating the island economy to prevent future generations experiencing economic and social decline in our communities. D, protecting the island's identity and its assets for future generations and strengthening community cohesion and resilience. And E, ensuring policy decisions and laws actively strengthen the ability of future generations to adapt to the pace of economic, technological, environmental and social change over time.
Deputy Wilson.
Thank you, sir. I think we all agree on something quite fundamental. Jersey is a wonderful place to live. But how will we make sure it will remain so, not just for us, but for our children and our grandchildren, the future generations? And that we're able to say with some confidence, we left things better than we found them. To see that our decisions now stand the test of time, and that we made these by choice and not by chance, to avoid storing up problems that someone else has to fix later. So at its heart, this proposition is about something quite straightforward: how we make better decisions. The reality is the decisions we take in the Assembly are not abstract. They are tangible and far-reaching, and in many cases difficult to undo, each with implications not just for today, but for the decades ahead. And that raises a fundamental question. Are we consistently set up to think long-term, or are the structures with which we operate sometimes pull us inevitably towards shorter-term fixes, immediate pressures, and electoral cycles that do not always align with the island's enduring interest? So the purpose of this proposition is not to reinvent the wheel. It's to strengthen the way the wheel turns, to provide a clearer, more consistent framework that helps us translate long-term ambition into day-to-day decision-making. And this is where the evidence becomes important. The Controller, in Auditor General, assessed performance against the indicators used to track progress on the Future Jersey vision in 2024 and concluded Jersey isn't meeting the ambitions it set out. The system is not yet doing what we think it is doing, and pointed to the following structural reasons, and I quote: a lack of clear and consistent accountability, gaps in how responsibilities are understood and applied, and no systematic way of demonstrating how decisions contribute to long-term outcomes. Either way, we have to accept we have a set of important aspirations we are not meeting, or change our ways to make sure that we do. Strengthen our resolve and act to ensure the intent is fully embedded in the ways decisions are made in practice. Intentions today are insufficient if they're untested, unexamined, or invisible to the wider community. Concentration of ministerial responsibility may be efficient in the short term, but it is fundamentally incompatible with how we should be organising for the longer term. If we adopt a duty to future generations law, we will be certain to design in and organise structures that protect long-term sustainability, intergenerational fairness and well-being. And that scenario is not unique to Jersey. Other jurisdictions have encountered the same challenge, and we don't have to look very far to see what is working in practice. In Wales, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act 2015 was introduced with real ambition. Deliberate choice was made to embed long-term thinking into the machinery of government, not as an optional extra, but as a core discipline. It created a framework that encourages public bodies to think beyond silos, to consider prevention as well as cure, and to weigh the long-term consequences of their actions. The early years of implementing the law were not straightforward. Public bodies weren't always clear on what was expected, and the cultural change took time, much longer than a political cycle. But what happened as a result is described as one of the largest public sector culture change programmes in Wales, where the system of governance moved from considering the future to being required to act on it. They didn't have a strategy, but completely rewired how government is expected to operate. So what they did was place a statutory duty on public bodies to think long-term, to prevent problems and to integrate decision-making across systems in the pursuit of well-being goals and setting wellbeing objectives to demonstrate how they contribute to long-term outcomes. They appointed a commissioner, a Future Generations Commissioner. They developed public service boards, and they introduced new ways of working that designed how decisions were made. But the biggest impact was the cultural shift in the work of the public sector. I'm not suggesting that this proposition calls for wholesale adoption of the Welsh model. That's not its purpose. What is signalling is that we need a system of governance built around long-term thinking, and Wales took that challenge on, one that emphasises prevention and is structured on integration, collaboration, and meaningful public engagement. At its heart, this proposition, if adopted, imposes a clear statutory duty on ministers to evaluate and account for the long-term impacts of the policies they bring before this Assembly. Embedding that discipline would strengthen decision-making, especially when we face complex, interconnected challenges that resist simple solutions. This is an obligation that cannot be filled in a single political term, nor by any one office holder. It is an ongoing responsibility, one that this Assembly and those that follow must continue to uphold. And all I am asking is, can we start the ball rolling and signal intent on this issue? In developing such an approach, we can learn from the Welsh experience, which highlights both the opportunities and the practical challenges of embedding long-term thinking into law. These lessons are directly applicable as we confront questions of sustainability, resilience, and the legacy we leave for future generations of the island. In summary, the Welsh model has not only built structures and changed processes, but it's also brought a cultural shift in how democracy operates. This is not mere rhetoric. There is a clearly defined operating model behind it, demonstrating that if long-term thinking is to be realised, it must be deliberately designed and not left to chance. The approach deliberately enforces integration across sectors rather than siloed policy, and even where specific policies or laws are not adopted, it shifts the policy baseline and sets out statutory expectations for how decisions can be made. The lesson is unmistakable. Long-term thinking does not happen by assumption or because people disagree with it. It happens by design. Where systems do not require it, short-term pressures dominate. Where accountability is unclear or diffuse, then outcomes become unpredictable. And that brings us back to Jersey. This is not a question of whether we care about the future, we clearly do. It's a question of whether the system we have designed makes it likely that we will deliver on that ambition. The Controller and Auditor General's report finds that by and large, outcomes are too often shaped by circumstance, by who happens to be making the decision, the pressures of the moment, and the weight given or not given to long-term considerations. In the drive to secure short-term results, we're seeing policy and legislation brought forward without sufficient regard for their longer-term consequences. That is where uncertainty creeps in and where a lack of joined-up thinking begins to undermine the system. This proposition seeks to change that. It would require consistent, system-wide consideration of long-term impacts for everything placed before us, improving the quality of decision-making and making it more transparent. So the question before us is not whether to add more policy, but whether to strengthen the framework within which all policy is made. This is a measured step in that direction. It places a clear duty on ministers to enhance accountability, to ensure decisions are properly integrated, and to demonstrate rather than assume the long-term implications of what they are bringing forward. In doing so, it moves us towards a system where conditions for better outcomes are designed in from the outset. If we choose not to take that step, then despite the best of intentions, the CAG's findings suggest that Jersey's future will continue, at least in part, to be shaped by chance. And she has pointed us to what is missing: clearer accountability, stronger integration into decision-making, and a more consistent expectation that long-term impact is demonstrated, not assumed. So perhaps the question for members is simply this. Do we believe the system we have today is enough to deliver the future we want? If the answer is yes, then we should be content with the evidence before us. But if the answer is no, even in part, then we have an opportunity here, not to start again, but to ensure that what we have already committed to is capable of delivering what we expect of it. So in conclusion, the recent Better Life Index shows Jersey scoring the lowest for civic engagement amongst OECD countries, which does not bode well for the future. How long will we continue to look at this or that situation or that scenario before we accept something different must be done to improve the position? How then will we shape systems for the future betterment of islanders if we are not engaging them in decisions affecting their lives? This proposition is not about whether we care about future generations. It is about whether we are prepared to shape a system that makes delivering for them more certain. If we do, we begin to shape something more deliberate, more consistent, and more accountable. That is the shift I am seeking. And so I ask members to support this request, to start the work to strengthen our system of accountability, to focus our decisions and efforts on outcomes, and to secure a sustainable, well-governed and prosperous island for generations to come. We can only achieve this by choice, not by chance, and design through a clear statutory framework. So I make the proposition.
Thank you, Deputy. Is the proposition seconded? Thank you. Chief Minister.
Thank you, sir. And I thank the proposer for bringing the matter to the Assembly and for the genuine good intention behind it. But regrettably, I rise, sir, to speak against it. But let me begin by making one thing absolutely clear. Opposing this proposition is not the same as opposing long-term thinking, sustainability, or responsibility to future generations. Those are values we all share, sir, and those are values I believe are at the forefront of all of our minds when we're making policy in this Assembly and in the government. The question before us is not whether we care about the future, it's whether this proposition will meaningfully improve how we govern. I do not believe it will. At first glance, the proposition is attractive. It speaks in broad and positive terms about the responsibility and about sustainability and intergenerational fairness. But when we look beyond the language and examine what it actually does, we find something slightly less compelling, sir. An unclear and unenforceable duty that risks adding further administrative burden without delivering real change. Ministers are already required to consider long-term impacts. We already operate within strategic frameworks that emphasise sustainable well-being and fiscal responsibility and environmental stewardship. The proposition does not strengthen those frameworks in any meaningful way. So, for example, what does it mean in practice to have regard to future generations? How is that assessed? What determines whether a minister has complied? The proposition does not answer these questions, and without clear definition, standards, or enforcement mechanisms, we risk creating a duty that exists on paper but has little effect in reality. There is also a risk of unintended outcomes by introducing another statutory requirement into the policy-making process. We risk slowing down decision-making at a time when agility is essential. Ministers and officials will feel compelled, even more compelled than they are now, sir, to produce additional assessments, not because they improve decisions, but because they satisfy a new procedural expectation. That, in my opinion, is not better governance. Members should also consider the issues of duplication. We already expect ministers and members of this Assembly to act in the long-term interests of the island. We already scrutinise policies for their economic, social and environmental impacts. There are already clear statutory duties in place. For example, the Public Finances Law requires ministers to consider the long-term sustainability of Jersey's finances and economy and the well-being of islanders across future generations. The Planning and Building
law places a direct duty on us to protect and improve, and improve our environment and natural resources. And beyond legislation, we are supported by independent oversight from Statistics Jersey and the long-term outcomes set out in the Future Jersey framework. So the question is not whether we consider the future, we already do. The question is whether adding another duty, another layer, improves that practice. Members may also wish to reflect upon the experience elsewhere. 10 years into the introduction of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in Wales, to which Deputy Wilson referred, an independent review by Audit Wales found that the Act has not delivered the system-wide change that was originally intended. That is exactly the risk we face here. Creating a broad statutory duty may sound positive, but without clear mechanisms, it does not automatically translate into better decisions or better results. If we are serious about the future, and I believe we are all serious, very serious about the future, that long-term thinking has been driving the policy of this government and this assembly. So, but if we are serious and want to improve it, we should focus on the measures that have a real impact. Strong scrutiny, clearer policy frameworks, better data and transparent reporting on longer term outcomes. These are the tools that will genuinely improve decision making, sir. In conclusion, sir, I thank again the Deputy for the proposition and well-intentioned thoughts, but for the reasons I have outlined in my speech, I urge the Assembly to reject it. Thank you.
Chief Minister. Deputy Miles.
Thank you, sir. I was very interested to see this proposition and read the intent behind it. And I think this isn't really about policy mechanics or legislative process. It is more about responsibility. And it's about whether we as an Assembly are prepared to take responsibility, not just for the people living in Jersey today, but for those who will live here long after we've gone. We all know how this Assembly works. We deal with immediate pressures, budgets, service demands, political priorities, and more often than not, short-term fixes to long-term problems. And that's totally understandable. These pressures are real. We feel them in the here and now. But what really concerns me, and what I think Deputy Wilson's proposition highlights, is that too often those short-term decisions are storing up long-term consequences. And it's consequences that someone else will have to deal with. It won't be us, it will be our future generations. Our children and our grandchildren and the islanders who will live here in 20, 30, 40, 50 years don't get a vote. They don't have a voice in this Assembly, but they will inherit everything that we leave behind, all the good and all the bad. And if we look at honestly where we are today, the warning signs are starting to emerge more starkly than ever before. We've all raised concerns about the sustainability of our public finances, the impact of our ageing population, the pressures on our health system that we've just heard about in the last 15 minutes, housing challenges, and whether our economy is actually properly set up and fit for the future. And all of these are issues that have developed over time, not because people made bad decisions, but because very often decisions weren't tested properly against a longer term impact. And that for me is the issue, sir. It's not necessarily bad intentions, but it's a lack of structured, consistent foresight. And in this respect, we're not starting from scratch. We already have a long-term vision for Jersey through the Future Jersey framework and its outcomes. We've already agreed the kind of island that we want to be: sustainable, fair, prosperous and resilient. And we've already set out outcomes around that, around the environment, the economy, community well-being, quality of life. So the question isn't whether we've got a vision. We have got a vision. But the real question is, are we consistently using that vision to guide our decisions? Or is it something that we refer to only occasionally for the common strategic policy, but certainly not systematically? So the vision exists, but it's not always embedded in how decisions are made day to day. And the Controller and Auditor General probably makes that clear in every report she writes. It sits alongside decision making, but not always within it. And I think that's the nub of what this proposition is seeking to address. As I've said, we've already got the future Jersey vision, we've already agreed the outcomes. But what this proposition does is make sure we actually use them, not just refer to them. So if we've taken the time to agree a long-term vision, then we should also require ourselves to test all our decisions against it, consistently, transparently, and over the long term. And I see Deputy Wilson's proposition as giving practical effect to that. It introduces a clear duty to consider how decisions affect the future and to show that work. It asks ministers to think about whether we actually are creating financial burdens that others will have to carry, whether we are damaging the environment in ways that cannot be undone, whether we're strengthening or weakening the long-term economy, whether we're protecting what makes Jersey Jersey, and whether we're preparing people for a world that is changing faster than ever. They are responsible questions that should always be at the forefront of our decision-making, and they align directly with the outcomes that have already been agreed. The comments put forward by the Council of Ministers suggest that ministers already think about the future. And yes, sometimes they do. But the problem is it's not consistent, it's not always visible, and it's not something we can reliably point to and say, yes, this decision has been properly tested against long-term outcomes. And for me, that's what's missing. And that's what a statutory duty provides. And it's something that scrutiny and scrutiny panels in the main often raise. The public are asking these questions. They want to know whether we're planning properly. They want to know whether the vision we've set out actually means something. And too often, we can't give a clear, evidence-based, data-driven answer. The world is changing more quickly than we would like. Technology is advancing, economies are shifting, demographics are changing, and global uncertainty is increasing. And all of this has an effect on such a small community. So it's no longer enough to have that vision in writing sat on a shelf, something that we pay lip service to. We have to embed that thinking in every decision we make. And that is an element that has actually been very successful in Wales. But for me, sir, this is ultimately about trust. Trust that when we say we're working towards a better future, we actually mean it. Trust that we're not passing on avoidable problems, and trust that we're matching our decisions to our ambitions. Do we want future generations to say, oh yes, they had a vision, but they didn't follow it through? Or do we want them to say, yes, they planned ahead, they acted responsibly, they thought about us? So I don't see this proposition as replacing the Future Jersey framework. I see it as strengthening it. It ensures it's used and not referenced. And as Deputy Wilson said, Jersey's not just about the people who live here today, it's also about the people who will live here in the future. And this proposition for me, sir, is about making sure that our actions actually match the vision we've already agreed. And for that reason, I wholeheartedly support it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Taylor.
Thank you, sir. So I'm glad that we're having a debate here and that there seem to be a number of members who are still willing to speak, because Deputy Wilson has brought a very important subject to the Assembly, and she does it on the basis that, of course, she uses the Welsh example, but it also recognises that far too often in politics, and it can be particularly pronounced in a small community like ours, that we are often focused on firefighting. So we're dealing with very immediate issues which are not even necessarily focused on the future, but are actually focused on things that have just happened. How do we react to that? How do we stop it happening again? And it can be also the very short-term future, things like the cost of living, which are absolutely real problems that people are dealing with, but of course which don't just occur overnight. And indeed, things like the cost of living, things like transport issues, things like environment, roads, whatever they are, education, all of these issues often don't just spring up, they have deep-seated causes and roots, and that's the same for positive and negative outcomes, sir. So I think it's really important that we do make that cause and consequence. And so a reason that I've particularly valued having the Deputy as my Vice Chair, and our Vice Chair indeed, on the Economic and International Affairs Scrutiny Panel, is that she doesn't just think about what's immediately in front of us. She attacks it from every angle, does the analysis, and that includes looking at future-proofing and a proper risk analysis, and I think that is what she is seeking to do here, sir. So I think, like the Chief Minister said, there is a great deal of agreement around the fact that we should all be having regard for all of these areas that are being put before us. And there are some areas that I particularly feel strongly about. I mean, if I'm looking through this list, I think something that we haven't done, particularly in Jersey, very well, and others might have their own particular paragraphs in this that speak to them more than others, is that I don't think we've been great in Part B when at preserving and protecting the natural environment from irreversible damage and to enable future generations' enjoyment of the island and its surroundings. I think what we've seen often around Jersey, whether it's in the coastline, less so in the interior, I think we've done a pretty good job actually preserving development to the urban areas and the south coast, actually. And although that's not been without problems, there has been a concerted effort to avoid ribbon development, for example, but I don't think we've done that around the coastline. And there are tensions, of course, between some of these things when it talks about the future economy. And there are, of course, and there have been in the past, I would call them rampant free market politicians who have then gone into government. And some of the consequences we've seen around some of these paragraphs, particularly B, with inappropriate development and still pushes for inappropriate development around our coastline, are a consequence of that politics. So this is where I have a genuine question for the Deputy in her summing up, is that I do share some of the concerns about how we get to this final point. So I do accept, actually, that when it comes to the Welsh example, although the Chief Minister has chosen to focus on the audit that took place, which says that maybe some of the aspirations haven't happened or they haven't happened quickly enough, there are also lots of positives that have come out of the fact that Wales have implemented this 10 years ago, and they are there to be seen, sir. However, I do wonder about how this would be implemented in law, and there might be different ways. So when the Deputy talks about implementing this in law, I'm wondering if actually that could take the form of a CRIA. So we know that we do have a child rights impact assessment in our current propositions. There's already a requirement, of course, for ministers when they're bringing forward new legislation to have a human rights impact assessment. There's now a requirement, of course, for children's rights impact assessment to happen to all members. And I must say, I think that's a double-edged sword, because I think what's happened in reality is that whilst the intention is that all members should be considering children, and I think, you could argue, because the Deputy does say, how does the Assembly assure itself that the needs of future generations are formally considered? Well, part of the way we do that should be through the career already, because the career children are the next generation. So anything we are considering should immediately consider children who are therefore the next generation. But it doesn't necessarily do the full job, I appreciate that. Deputy Wilson will be thinking not just of the next generation, it will be about the one after that and the one after that. So it's more strategic and systemic, I accept that. But I do pose the question, do we already have something there which goes part of the way to doing that? But at the same time, I ask the question, is the career that effective? What I see happening often now is that members, especially backbenchers who are perhaps so busy writing propositions, and then the career is almost done for us. And often the answer will be there are no child's rights impact assessment in this proposition, where of course there will always be children's rights impact assessment, because this is about what happens in the future and how they might be impacted. It's just they won't necessarily be children. That's the difference. So something that affects children now might not be affecting them later, because they'll be grown up, hopefully. So there are all these questions that I think need to be answered. The next point I would ask, and probably I'll make this as my last point, is that I do think that there's also a tension insofar, coming back to my first point about the tension between the environmental impact and sometimes the economy. And there are those who will say, look, blow the environment as long as we're making money, everything's going to be okay. Hopefully there are not too many of those who will find themselves in this assembly in the future, but we know that can happen. What if a particular party decides that it wants to stand on a manifesto of complete liberalisation and actually saying, I think we should completely develop St Juan's Bay, and I think we should actually let people on the North Coast develop their houses into hotels, and that we should just let the market dictate, because actually, you know, that's going to bring more tourism in. We should put lots of big hotels around the airport and harbour, and I support Strive. I don't mind putting that on record. I think what came back there is actually going to be vital for the economy, but it's right that there's a process that went through that put the environmental and the social challenges that it faced and balanced those up rightly. But what if that kind of government got elected on a mandate of actually saying it's okay to destroy the environment because we think in balance we've still got enough environmental pockets around where people can enjoy themselves, and this is the only way to secure the economy in the future? How would we then implement that in law to say that they have to have consideration to Part B when actually getting rid of Part B is part of their core manifesto? So I know that might be an extreme example, but I think I'd like to hear back about how this might work in reality, as well as, in fact, whether this is just, again, something that could amend current law. So is this a case of implementing complete new primary legislation, or are there ways that this could be put into current laws so that we're all giving consideration? So the bottom line, sir, is that absolutely this should be something that we're building in, and future Assembly members and future governments should be building in, I think, automatically. And the onus should be on all politicians in future to make sure that they've had due regard for all of these areas. The Deputy's right is that, especially in a small island with, I would say, an unsophisticated form of politics, still doesn't necessarily guarantee that when it comes to manifesto writing, that all of these things would be covered. But I would like to give an assurance that whatever happens here today, that Reform Jersey as a party is very mindful of the fact that we shouldn't just be focused on the immediate issues. We do have to give people hope and answers for the next few years, but actually we should very much be focused on what Jersey is going to leave for future generations in 10, 20, 50, but also 100 years' time, to make sure that we've got the kind of island that everybody can enjoy, that everyone can be part of and be productive in, and that actually that island both includes something that's environmentally intact and tangible, but also one that people can enjoy themselves in, be happy and live long and prosperous lives there. So I do thank the Deputy for bringing this to our attention.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Doublé.
Thank you, sir. And I wanted to start by emphatically agreeing with Deputy Miles on something that she said about this proposition, that it matches the vision that we have already agreed. And I think that's the core principle that I wanted to get across to members today with this proposition. I think there are new ideas here, but again, Deputy Tadia spoke along these lines as well, that I very much think that this is along the lines of things that we have already agreed to. And I would remind members about corporate parenting and our responsibilities to the UNCRC. Deputy Tadia raised some really good questions about how this might work in reality. I've had similar thoughts and have some suggestions, actually. And in terms of the comments to this proposition, sir, and whilst I do understand that this is right at the end of the term, at the end of an order paper, I would really have liked for the Council of Ministers to maybe consider amending this and to have taken more of a what can we do and what could we take on board from this approach, rather than dismissing it and asking us to reject it, which I won't be doing, so I will be supporting it. And the report to the proposition talks about Wales and the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And we had a Welsh parliamentarian visiting Jersey very recently, Joyce Watson, who is a very respected parliamentarian. And I was very lucky to have some time with her to show her the island. And we talked a little bit about some of the things that happen in Wales. And I really think that Wales is getting it right in some of the areas that we need to aspire to, and this is one of them. And the comments to the from the Council of Ministers pulled out one line from a report that said that the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is not driving the system-wide change that was intended. And that's not the whole picture, sir, and I think just because something hasn't quite yet achieved everything that it set out to do doesn't mean you just throw it in the bin. And we can reflect on our own careers in the same respect. Now, careers are something that I brought forward with a backbencher proposition many years ago, and we still haven't got it right. But it doesn't mean that we should stop doing them. It means that we need to be a bit better at doing them. And again, Deputy Tadjer mentioned the fact that we need to look at careers a bit earlier. That it needs to be the first thing that we are reflecting on when we're thinking about ideas for propositions and legislation, and we can do better at that. And I have hope, sir, that this Assembly and the next Assembly, whatever that looks like, can and will improve even further, and that cultural change will continue to happen. We've come such a long way in terms of considering children's rights. When I reflect upon my first term, Sarah, in this Assembly, and I was laughed at sometimes for raising children in the context of various debates, including environmental debates about land, etc., and play space. But I'm no longer laughed at for raising children. It's something that we have a consensus about in this Assembly, and we have made huge progress. We've got more that we need to do. We need to be using those careers a bit more meaningfully. There are other documents, Sarah, and other things that were mentioned in, I think, the Chief Minister's speech, which I listened to with interest, actually, because sometimes I think we don't actually understand how much we are doing, and I think there's probably more already being done than I realised. I still think that we should support this proposition today, sir. A document I was surprised that the Chief Minister didn't mention, and forgive me if I missed it, Deputy Jearn and myself, under the previous Home Affairs Minister, Deputy Miles, we had an equality impact assessment document put in place, which is something that all policy officers have available to them to assist them in reflecting and to assist ministers in reflecting. And I think that document actually could be built upon. I think the fact that it wasn't mentioned means that it does perhaps need to be used more meaningfully and further embedded in the work of ministers and of government. But I can see several ways that the intent behind this proposition could actually be embedded in some of the things that we've already got, including the career and including the equality impact assessments that are already in place within government. And the reason why we need some kind of mechanism or a formal step in our decision making to think about future generations, because our brains are not set up to automatically do this. There's a psychological mechanism called hyperbolic, I've forgotten the word of it now, sorry, sir. Where's it gone? Hyperbolic discounting. And it basically means that we live in the present in the main, don't we? It's very hard for our brains to actually regularly think that far ahead to future generations. And because we're not doing that automatically, we need a system and a mechanism in place that actually gives us that notification of, hey, please remember to do this. I think it's reasonable to have this in our decision-making processes. And another thing I wanted to bring to members' attention is the voice of children in this matter. And in 2020, a very interesting case was brought against over 30 European governments, and it was brought to the European Court of Human Rights by a group of young people. I think it was a group of Portuguese young people, actually. And they asked the court about this very matter that we're discussing today, and that they felt, and it was focused on environmental matters, but they felt that their governments were not giving adequate consideration to their future well-being and to the well-being of future generations. Now, the court did say that they couldn't hear that in that court because there needed to be action taken locally and within their individual governments first. But actually that court affirmed the principle. It didn't deny that that principle is important. So I would really like members to bear those young people in mind and to think, you know, what would, if we had children in this assembly here today, what would they be saying to us? What would they want us to do? If we had the youth parliament here today, how do we think that that youth assembly would actually vote on this? Because this proposition is about children today, it's not about us. I'm middle-aged, so I'm halfway through my life. And I could see eyebrows being raised. Yes, I've spent a quarter of my life in this chamber. But we must think about not ourselves and what maybe this is an administrative burden that might be placed on the adults in government today. Fine, I'll take it. I'll take that small administrative burden to actually get better quality decisions that are giving due consideration to the children who are coming after us. And I think in terms of the direction of other jurisdictions, this is where things are headed. Other jurisdictions will be doing this. And I would really like Jersey to be a trailblazer, which we have done with our indirect incorporation of the UNCRC. And we mustn't stop there. This actually, I see as a stepping stone to the direct incorporation, because we have our CREAs, which is us giving due regard to children's rights here and now when we make our propose our laws and propositions. This would give a stepping stone towards the direct incorporation of the UNCRC. I think it's very sensible. I think it's very doable within the CREA or within the equality impact assessments or other ways. I think that it's something that the next government could very easily put into place. And I will be supporting it today, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Gardner.
Thank you, sir. And I'm pleased to follow a previous speaker, and I will not speak about the process, but what's in the heart of this proposition that in front of us today? It's very simple. Before we make the decisions, we pause, we consider, and we ask, what will this mean for the next generation? And let's be honest here. When we choose to borrow, and we are going to borrow substantial amount of money very soon, and when we choose to spend our reserves, we already agree to spend reserves and not when we know that they're really low level, we are already shaping the future. These decisions that we made last December to spend reserves actually will impact children who are not in this assembly today. They will impact them. So the question is whether we affect future generations, we clearly do. We do affect future generations. But the question in front of us today is, do we do it consciously, transparently, and consistently? And basically, today, Deputy Wilson asked us to consider, do we ask statutory duty? It will be clear requirement from the minister to assess, to record and show how policies and laws impact future generation. Not as an afterthought, we had lots of afterthoughts, not as a general statement, but as a part how we are making decisions. Now, comments paper. I read the comments paper, and the comments paper tell us we already take future generations into account. The Chief Minister's speech said we are doing this and that, we're doing laws to consider. But the question, if we do it consistently, do we do it without contradictions? And for me, future generations not about just about the finance, it's about health, life chances, and inequality that begins in childhood. It was interesting that Deputy Tadia raised how does it affect environment, and I completely agree. Let's think about specific examples. And I'm coming from a place of children and education, that is my heart. Let us bring down to a real example. Last week, our health measurements were published. Health measurements, I think it was. So last week reports are saying that 35% of children in government school at age 11 are overweight or obese. compared to 22% in the private schools that are rate obese. Now, they're not just overweight, they're also undernourished. There's not right balance. Why I'm giving this example? Because we all know, and over 4 ministers, including myself, we work to introduce meals into schools to balance their diet. And during my time, I doubled the schools, and I really welcome Education Minister that currently not in the room, that he continued this plan, and now all schools do have school meals. But as Deputy Tidy and Deputy Duble said, we are talking about the careers. So this step meant the careers. It was real progress, but it's not enough. It's wider community health impact, and this is where career does not require it. And this is where we have a contradiction. Last year, to this year, because last year it's finished, this year the health department cut funding for the Henry program that was run by Family Nursing. Okay, what is Henry program? Henry program, it's not theoretical policy, it was practical, face-to-face support for families, helping parents to understand nutrition, routine, parenting, giving them confidence to make changes that would work in real life. Through this work and wider childhood health improvement project, they are so clearly beyond just the measurements. We have stable measurements, but they're really, really high. 53% of adults are obese or overweight. But this project tells us something very, very important, that we are not doing enough to reduce the problem, and it does not capture the full picture. We are seeing more selective eaters. The children have healthy BMI by poor nutrition, and it affects their development, their concentration at school, their mental and dental health. So this project, Henry, worked directly with families and seen something very clearly, that it's not that parents are not unwilling, they're overwhelmed, they need practical support, it's not just information, they need to feel empowered, judged, and be taught. And this project was cut. And for me, this is why proposition does matter, that the Council of Ministers, or all assembly, will work together, and we will not have two contradiction policies, one supporting and one cancelling the health outcome for the public, and it will not come through the careers, but it would come if we ask what our future generation need, and what kinds of preventive, human-centered program we would like to have. It cannot measure it in the short term, because the results will be in the long term. So for me, this proposition does not prescribe outcomes. This proposition do not remove democratic choice. What is simply require us to think, to evidence, and to show how our decisions affect the future. We can say we consider this, and this is what does it mean. And we cannot delay it, because it's not, oh, we can do it in 4 years and 5 years, because it still will take time. As Deputy Duble said, we start somewhere, but it takes time to really implement it and to embed it, to feel it. And I personally will support the proposition, because future generations, our children, my child, will not judge us on what we said in the assembly, how it's important. They will charge us what we choose to protect, to cut, or to fund, and prioritize. So voting for this proposition is show that we are ready to take responsibility seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Feltham.
Thank you, sir. I have to say that I find the timing of this proposition and this debate quite awkward. It does feel somewhat like an outgoing assembly seeking to decide what some of the policy priorities of an incoming assembly may well be in the summer. And I was reminded that I did indeed think about bringing a similar proposition myself earlier on at the beginning of this term, when the initial government put together its common strategic policy. I looked at that at the time, and I felt that it was lacking but decided at the time that the better way of going about that would be to bring amendments to that common strategic policy. And that is indeed where we ended up as an assembly, making reference in that first common strategic policy. And I'm pleased to say that the new government 2 years later also made reference to the Future Jersey outcomes measures. So when I looked at this proposition, it does seem to be something that is going to require quite a lot of work that could actually be simplified. For me, rather than requiring legislation and law officer time and all of the work and expenditure that would be required with that, the most efficient and effective way of achieving the aim that is set out in this proposition would actually be for the incoming assembly to make commitments in their common strategic policy. The commitments of that assembly based on that assembly's mandate. For me, there's no requirement, there's no need to spend the money on law drafting. We all know that we'll have other priorities that will need law drafting, and we wouldn't want to hold that up. But the assembly, the incoming assembly, will have the perfect opportunity to make the type of commitments that are being talked about within this proposition, within the process that already exists. And that, to me, would be the most efficient and effective way of getting the type of outcomes that the Deputy would want. So I would like the Deputy, in her summing up, actually, to explain why she didn't bring this proposition earlier on in this term of office, because I think that would have been a more effective time to bring that, so that this assembly could make a commitment for this assembly. Why she doesn't think that the new assembly coming in with its new mandate based on the manifestos that the members will have taken to the public, why the common strategic policy process can't deliver outcomes that she's looking for, and why she thinks that this is the most efficient and effective way to do it, because I certainly don't. I think that we already have mechanisms that can lead to the next assembly making the types of commitments that the Deputy's asking for here. So I will vote against this proposition, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Mellor.
Thank you, sir. Sir, it will probably come as no surprise that I'm also not going to support this proposition. This proposal will add complication and additional work to the existing processes, needing more resource and likely additional growth in the public service, something which we are all told continually the public want to see less of. We already have requirements to consider sustainability of finances and sustainable well-being built into our laws. These were recognised by the CNAG in her 2024 report of the Performance Framework. As she said, Jersey is a leading jurisdiction by enshrining into law a requirement to consider sustainable well-being in government decision-making, and also that Jersey has been at the forefront of best practice in implementing a requirement to consider sustainable well-being in government decision-making. Those requirements are already in our public finances law. Treasury has also initiated a number of initiatives to promote longer-term thinking, including the establishment of the Jersey Capital Investment Funds, which we supported this week, the development of a long-term capital plan, and a shift to long-term financial planning. These initiatives are closely aligned to the aims of this proposition and create a better approach for a small island than implementing yet more legislation and disproportionate bureaucracy, which is better suited to larger jurisdiction. And I think, sir, my biggest problem with this is that it aims only at government and the Council of Ministers. Deputy Miles talks about alleges a lack of structured and consistent foresight. That appears to relate to ministers, but what about everyone else? Any backbencher can bring forward a proposition which doesn't look beyond the end of next week, and we will all vote for it because it's nice. we're giving a lollipop to someone and we support it, and perhaps because it's in the run-up to an election. So any legislation that requires government to think and look forward must also apply to backbench propositions. We need to be clear, anybody bringing a proposition needs to look forward. Deputy Dubley mentioned several, and Deputy Taddy and Deputy Dubley have talked about some of the impact assessments, child rights impact assessment, human rights impact assessments, economic impacts. I'm not sure we do enough of those. And in fact, one of the things I am pleased about is that we have referenced Wales. And Derek Walker, who is the Commissioner for Future Generations in Wales, came to the island, I think in 2024, and I spent some time with him. And one of the things that he said was that they found themselves in a position where they had so many impact assessments, it was turning into a cottage industry and nothing was getting done. So they refined into a single assessment, and I can't remember in the lapse of time what it covered, but they narrowed it down for the sake of avoiding bureaucracy into a single impact assessment. We need to stop introducing bureaucracy. And this debate allows me to repeat, and I'm sure many of you have heard it before, to repeat my favourite quote of the last couple of years. And it is from Derek Walker, the Commissioner for Future Generations in Wales, in his talk. And I don't remember, it was the talk was organised by the CNAG. I don't recollect a vast number of States members attending that talk, although we were all invited. But he said during his talk, well, we can do this in Wales and we do that, and there's all sorts of things we could be doing. But we have to remember that we are a small jurisdiction of 5 million people. We are a small jurisdiction of 100,000 people, and we must bear that in mind when we create ever more bureaucracy and legislation. If there's a problem, let's sit down, address the problem, and find a practical way of fixing it, because making a law is not necessarily a solution to any problem. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Brenoff.
Thank you, sir. So I'm pleased we've had such a good debate, because it does feel like we're engaging some quite big questions, and I think this proposition does ask some big and urgent questions. It is about a massive systemic cultural change, really, and I think the government's response shows why it's needed. The one thing that government knows it wants, and which is an easily stated goal, is economic growth. I fear the Chief Minister's already bored. That is what we are increasingly hearing is the goal around which everything else is organised, not just here actually, but everywhere. And of course, economic growth is very important. That goal is part of our culture. But that should not be our goal in isolation. I would say that sustainable well-being is a much better goal than economic growth, if you want a meta goal for society. Where are we as a society? How well is our society working? Some of us, I think, are about to find out some quite sharp answers to that question. We have a very widespread anger and frustration. There is a collapse in faith in politics from an already low base. And part of that, I would say, is because people do not see a clear link between politics and their lives. And in particular, in this context, they don't see a clear link between economic growth and better lives. The famous heckle during a Brexit debate 10 years ago at a public meeting in the northeast of England still resonates. At that meeting, the great and the good, I think it was the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England who was speaking, argued that Brexit would have a long-term negative effect on economic growth. And a woman shouted from the audience, "That's your economic growth, not ours." Actually, she used quite a pithy epithet. in the middle of that. We all know that, of course, there's a link between economic growth, a growing economy, and what government wants and needs to do. Without it, we can't fund the services that the public want and expect. But what that question said was, we need to think a bit more deeply about what the purpose of society is. Our economic system is in crisis because it is failing to deliver for enough people what an economy should deliver. Decent living standards, hope for their children, and so on. And that has led to the crisis in our democratic system. And I'm talking more widely than Jersey here. I don't just mean low voter turnout. The sense of anger that people feel about their lives spiraling out of control, and government doesn't address what they want it to address. I think the problem we have, in terms of the Better Life Index, which holds up quite a unflattering mirror up to us. It's not just the low voter turnout, which we all know about. Even if you abstract that from the Better Life Index figures that came out last week, I'm afraid the bromide that we repeat over and over again in this assembly about what an amazing place Jersey is to live in is not altogether shared. A lot of people do not think it is a great place to live in at the moment. They certainly believe, I think it has the potential to be a great place to live in, but they do not think that, and that is what the Better Life Index told us. So what is our big, imaginative and creative response to that situation? Well, I think what we have, of course, is terrific inertia in the system. Oh my word, how would you make this happen? So much bureaucracy, administrative burden. The Chief Minister and the Treasury Minister say essentially that we already have the mechanisms in place, that the current framework works. I think that the assessment would have to be that from the public's point of view, they don't see it. It's not about additional reports. It's not about a different common strategic policy. It's about the change in mindset. And I would say it's about to answer the Social Security Minister's point, it is about a legal commitment that transcends one government. I've got news for the Treasury Minister. It's a shame she's not here to hear me convey it to her. She says that her main objection to this proposition is that that backbenchers need to think about these questions of sustainable finances. Can I just inform the Treasury Minister that law applies to everyone? That's the whole point. A law brought in to achieve this would compel backbenchers to follow it. It would achieve the very thing that she says is what's missing. Well, well. The Treasury Minister also said that Wales has narrowed it down. Well, yes, great. They've narrowed down the scope. They've worked out how to make it work more efficiently. Great news. We can learn, can we not, from the experience of other jurisdictions. It's also been argued, and the quote has been used twice now, that the Sustainable Wellbeing Act didn't deliver a clear system-wide change. I met Jane Davidson when she came to the island in the middle of this term of the estates. She was the woman who did more than any other to drive that agenda through in Wales. And she was candid, she fully understood. But she saw it not as a problem, that was just part of the ongoing process of refinement and improvement and making things better. But it emphatically did deliver change. In 2019, the Act informed the overturning of a plan to spend 1.4 billion on a 14-mile extension of the M4 motorway bypassing Newport. That's one of the most famous examples. Instead, a sustainable network of additional rail stations, rapid bus routes and cycle corridors was announced, and Wales now has a plan to increase public transport, walking and cycling to 45% of journeys by 2045. That's what effect it had. It drove the increase in recycling rates in Wales. Wales ranks now second in the world for recycling because they have embedded sustainable well-being. And the Act has, to my first question and my very first point, the Act has also changed how prosperity is defined. Government and public bodies are now required by law, for example, as part of that, to deliver fair work and a low-carbon society, rather than measuring progress through GDP alone. But sustainable well-being is also, of course, about how you finance government into the future. It provides a far better framework for considering the very real trade-offs that future governments are going to have to make between tax and spend, where we get our money from, what taxes we raise, and how we make our spending choices. It would provide a new framework, a new lens to see those questions through. It's understandable the government doesn't want it. It does challenge the way we work. And I know that the government is taking on board some of this agenda, and every government has made an attempt to reflect this in their thinking. Every government has. I accept the present government has been sincere in that. Our government certainly was as well. But this is about a process. It's about deepening the engagement with these issues. Government has its groove with regard to the current requirements. It is done in a familiar way. There is a muscle memory for how to deal with how we approach that question that's in our current law. It is to some extent done by rote. Similar paragraphs appear in every budget. As Deputy Miles says, at the moment, sustainable well-being sits alongside policy making. It isn't as deeply embedded as it could be. So the central argument from the government is that everything is okay in our sustainable well-being ambitions. This proposition says it isn't. It says we need to raise our game. The government needs to rethink how it approaches long-term sustainability. What we have now isn't good enough. It isn't about tying the hands of future governments. That betrays a terrible poverty of imagination. This is about trying to improve the way we do government in the interests of everyone. And it is also, critically, about the power of law. Once something becomes a legal matter, as you will know, sir, it engages the policy-making brain a lot more urgently. In fact, I would say it rewires the policy-making brain. That is the whole point. It is transformative. We've seen that with human rights, for example. The incorporation of the European Convention has been transformative. And it gives the public a powerful lever to hold us to account. And without that, it doesn't happen. So for me, adopting this proposition means adopting an agenda that would signal the kind of decisive shift, the kind of transformative moment, the kind of sit up and take notice that the public need to see. And on that basis, I shall support it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Mezak.
Thank you, sir, and I'm sorry to bring some members of the Assembly back to reality, but the way that you secure the best outcomes for future generations is not to establish a framework that creates civil service non-jobs to write reports that nobody ever reads, but it's by the public of Jersey electing a government with a platform of tangible policies that are in the interests of future generations. That is real politics, not the politics of vibe over substance, which is what I'm sorry to say this proposition is. And sir, guess what? We're all going to disagree on what that substance is, because that's the nature of politics, and passing a law that says you must think about this does not guarantee any of those outcomes in any shape or form. Sir, Deputy Gardner, in her speech, referred to the budget from last year. She said where we had spent reserves, and that will have an impact on future generations. A fair point, perhaps, but what did we spend it on? We spent it on establishing a back-to-school bonus and free childcare, which will have an impact on future generations. It's all subjective, and we'll all disagree on that. And I'll come back to that shortly. But, sir, I would argue that an agenda that includes things like establishing a new residential tenancy law to provide support for children who live in rental accommodation so they can't be kicked out for unfair reasons or their parents exposed to unjustifiable rent hikes, or, sir, proposing abolishing the fee for young people to see a GP, something that members of the previous government voted against, and, sir, establishing a framework of progressive taxation are all things that are part of our platform that would have a tangible impact on delivering better outcomes for future generations. And those are the subjects that we ought to be debating. So my calculations here are extremely rudimentary, but if I make just a couple of assumptions on this, that what happens as a result of establishing this kind of statutory duty is that we create a workload within the civil service to produce the documents that have to substantiate that thinking on future generations. Let's just argue that in total that amounts to the equivalent of 2 full-time employees on a civil service salary, again, number out of thin air here, but let's just say £40,000 a year, so £80,000 a year in total. We would need to have, by my calculations, 10 workers in the private sector on the average salary to generate enough tax revenue to pay for that work. And those reports, which many of us will not have regard for because they don't reach conclusions that meet our preconceived positions, when that money could have been spent on something else. That is something that no matter whether you're on the left of politics or the right of politics, we must accept our government needs to get away from that kind of thinking where we create jobs funded by taxpayers to do things that are not particularly productive, rather than having better political leadership that makes the decisions that are in the interests of our community. And so it was amusing listening to Deputy Renouf, who said that looking at the government's response to this proposition, he thought there needed to be a culture change. Well, I would ask, what culture was there for the year and a half when he was in power, where they did things like vote against free GP appointments and other things that are clearly in stark contrast to the lofty principles that they would argue are in this proposition? So much has been said to cite the example of Wales. And it's amusing, sir, because the government that established the framework that's being extolled by this proposition is about to be kicked out of office next month, or just after, a month just after, when they have their election. All opinion polls are that that government is going to be heavily rebuked by the public because, sir, and we can all tell why, because they themselves have that agenda of vibe over substance and people aren't feeling the difference that government is meant to be delivering for them. So I hardly extol them as a great example of something to be copying here. Sir, I'm going to use a historic example now of why I have no inclination to support this proposition, and I suspect I may not get some of the foot stomping from colleagues that I did just get, sir, but I'm reminded of the infamous government budget from 10 years ago, where, among many other measures, it was proposed to abolish the single-parent component of income support. That, sir, meant that the family group that statistics showed us was most at risk of living in poverty in Jersey had £2,000 a year of support for those households cut. So if this law had been in place then, what impact would it have had on that decision? It would have had no impact on it, because the government of the day knew what they wanted to do, pressed ahead with it, and made an argument. What instead would have happened is that somebody in Cyril and Markle House, as it was at the time, would have spent an afternoon coming up with a couple of paragraphs for the report of that proposition that attempted to justify, within these terms, what they were doing anyway. It would have served as no safeguard against that policy that most of us would recognise was against the needs of future generations, because it was a political decision to make that policy and implement it. Because that's what, at the end of the day, this is all really about. It's about politics and democracy. And if we want to have governments that safeguard the interests of future generations and implement policies that set the framework for allowing them to prosper, the duty, sir, is on the public of Jersey to elect governments that have the agenda to deliver on that. And passing a law that most likely will just create a couple of non-jobs in the civil service to write reports that most people either don't read or don't have regard for is not the panacea that we are being sold here. And it's important to bring us back to reality and recognise that, because we shouldn't be spending our time on those completely intangible things. We should be spending our time debating the policies that will leave a better island for those future generations. One where there is less poverty, one where there's more affordable housing, one where waiting lists in our health system are lower. That is what we ought to be spending our time on, and we're going to have loads of disagreements along the way, and we'll have different ideas for how we do that. But somebody somewhere coming up with a report that measures it against a principle which we can see in Wales is not making any difference, is not going to fix our politics. And that's why we need politics of the substance and not of the vibe. And I vote against this proposition because it is vibe over substance.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Kovac.
Thank you, sir. So I will start by acknowledging we all share the same goal, to leave this island in a stronger position for future generations, and that is not in dispute. The real question is whether this proposition is the right way to achieve it. In my opinion, it is not, because the evidence does not support the idea that creating a new statutory duty will meaningfully improve decision-making. Firstly, Jersey already has legal obligations that require long-term thinking. The Public Finances Law explicitly requires ministers to consider long-term sustainability across economic, social, environmental, and cultural well-being. Our planning laws already enshrine protection of the natural environment and island character. These are not optional considerations. They are statutory duties that already exist. Secondly, we already have multiple independent mechanisms designed to challenge short-termism. The Fiscal Policy Panel consistently reports on long-term fiscal risks, including the impact of an aging population. The Comptroller and Auditor General highlights structural weaknesses in areas like healthcare sustainability. Scrutiny panels regularly test whether policies are aligned with long-term objectives. The issue, therefore, is not the absence of frameworks, but how effectively we use them. Thirdly, there is limited evidence that similar legislation delivers better outcomes. In Wales, for example, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act has been reviewed after nearly a decade, and the conclusion was clear. While it raised awareness, it has not driven the system-wide change that was intended. That is a significant warning. We should not assume that legislating for intent automatically leads to better results. Fourthly, this proposal risks creating unintended consequences. It would likely introduce additional layers of reporting, compliance, and possibly new oversight structures. That means more time spent producing assessments and less time delivering results. It also risks turning inherently complex long-term judgments into box-ticking exercises where the process is followed, but the quality of decisions does not improve. And finally, we must recognize that long-term impact is often uncertain and subjective. Predicting economic, technological, or social conditions decades ahead is inherently difficult. Good governance requires flexibility, judgment, and accountability, not rigid statutory tests that may constrain decision-making without improving it.
What has been said about child's rights impact assessment, human rights impact assessments, economic assessments, equality impact evaluation guidance, and including the intensive research work I've done in the last few months on gender-sensitive policy and budgeting, but didn't complete how I hoped, are all valid points. Perhaps a way forward would be to combine all this into a single simplified assessment for use across government and the Assembly. This, though, won't be achieved through legislating through this proposition or within this term, but should be a consideration for the next Assembly, and if I return, I will certainly work towards it. I welcome the focus on long-term planning that this proposition encourages. Our party is committed not just to short-term fixes, but to policies that create lasting benefits for future generations. We've heard from Deputy Feltham how she amended in 2022 the Common Strategic Policy to include future Jersey, showing that meaningful long-term planning can be achieved without new legislation. This is about practical policies that have a real impact over time. Rejecting this proposition does not mean ignoring the problem. It means focusing on what will actually make a difference. Better use of scrutiny, clearer long-term planning, more transparency with the public, and stronger political accountability for the decisions we take. Ultimately, no law can substitute for responsibility. It is up to us, as elected representatives, to think beyond the short term, and we already have the tools to do so. For those reasons, I do not support this proposition, and not because the goal is wrong, but because this is not the most effective or proportionate way to achieve it. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Stevenson.
Thank you, sir. What an interesting debate, and I think the subject matter is interesting, but so are some of the arguments being taken and how they're being presented to us today. I think on what could be the final day in this assembly of this political term, I think it's fascinating indeed. And I wasn't intending to speak, but I've been inspired to do so by some of the speeches. A lot of the very positive stuff I wanted to say has already been covered, so I will cut that out of my speech, but I will share a few other things that I think we haven't quite reflected on yet. A couple of speakers have seemed to infer that we just don't need this, and that the election is the way of ensuring that you get such decision making. But this isn't a radical way forward. Countries all over the world are taking these kind of decisions and showing what can be done with it. And we've talked a lot about Wales, but there's also places like Malta, Finland, Hungary. Scotland and Ireland have committed to enshrining the principles in future legislation. Germany, Canada have their own different versions. In 2024, the UN adopted the Declaration on Future Generations, which has guiding principles, commitments, and actions for implementation, because it's the action that follows from something like this that, as so many speakers have quite rightly pointed out, that's where the meaningful stuff happens and follows from. And I absolutely agree it needs to be meaningful. But the fault of something not being meaningful, or saying that we shouldn't have it because the words themselves are not meaningful, doesn't make having such an act or an approach pointless in the first place. It just emphasises that it's then those in power, it's up to them to make it meaningful and to take action based on those words, those legal commitments that we're talking about here. So for me, it's not good enough to say that, don't worry, we're handling it, or we've got it, or elect us and we will handle it, because it's about building in a system that enables that to happen across election cycles, no matter who is elected. We know that I think Jersey history clearly shows that we can't make good, long-term, sustainable decisions when with election cycles interrupting those along the way. The way to make meaningful change happen in our island is to take people with you across those 4-year cycles as well. So to me, it's about how we find ways of doing that. And this is exactly how you can do that. I went to a speech a couple of years ago from given by Serena Guthrie, who, as many people know, is Jersey woman who captained England, and the takeaway from her was to leave your own version of the dress in a better place. And the dress in her case, obviously, was the England netball team and the dress, but actually, it's a common thought process you can adapt to other versions. What's your version of the dress? What is our version of the dress here today in this States Assembly as we're at the end of our 4-year term? I think that's something for us to all think about. So I don't take the point, actually, that it's all just about an election and a 4-year cycle. It goes beyond those 4-year cycles and this Assembly. And there were a number of, I think, points made by different ministers that I thought about responding to, but it's the last day of this Assembly, as I say, and I just don't think it's productive, because I think it's a shame that a debate like that goes like that, to be perfectly honest, because this proposition talks about collaboration, talks about people working together with a common aim, and this is about agreeing that common aim. Deputy Feltham did talk about maybe the next States Assembly or a new States Assembly should look at something like this, but of course, if it is then put into legislation, they will get the chance to as well, won't they? So that's important to me. The Chief Minister, of course, referred to the 10-year review that was carried out by Audit Wales on the Welsh example. And as other speakers have said, there was a lot more in that report than simply saying that it's not working as well as it could be. And I just want to read the quote that comes from the Adrian Crompton, the Auditor General in Wales, and it's on their front page when you go to this 10-year review. And if I can just make sure that I get it back, then I will. 10 years on from its inception, I see energy and enthusiasm for the Act in various quarters, and I see public bodies having different conversations, making decisions informed by the Act and changes in practice. But for all the good examples, there are those that are not so good. The Act is not driving the system-wide change that was intended. Of course, driving change across often large, complex organisations is hard, but I urge public bodies to see the Sustainable Development Principle as a value for money issue. We cannot afford to design solutions that do not meet people's needs, burden future generations with avoidable higher costs, or miss opportunities to deliver more with the same or less. Sir, I think that is a very, very relevant message to Jersey today, and I will absolutely be supporting this.
Thank you, Deputy. Does anyone else wish to speak? Rob Ward.
Thank you, sir. I thought I would speak on this. It's interesting that what we seem to be doing here is outsourcing the need for consistent principles across governments. And to me, sir, the way to do that and the importance there is the role of properly established parties with clear principles that they've stuck to for many, many years. And that's why I stand as a member of a political party. Now, you may not agree with my principles, and that's fine. That's called politics. Whether you come from the left, the right, or so many who claim to be in the centre, it'd be interesting if they find what the centre is in the next election. That'd be interesting. There has to be a set of principles there. And I'm not talking about pseudo-parties. I'm not talking about so-called collections of independents working together, because there's no accountability for that. And if the way that accountability is going to be happening, when we don't know who's funding those groups, we don't know where their money's come from, we don't know where allegiances are, and then eventually they collapse anyway, halfway through a term sometimes, then what we have is a systemic issue with our political structure. And you're not going to solve that with this process. Now, there are other reasons as well why I've been interested in the debates, listening to people talking about, if you like, it seems to be a sort of cure-all for our lack of political consistency, a cure-all for the decision-making process which seems to go from pillar to post. But it isn't. You're not going to be able to legislate for that. All you can do is consistently approach politics on this island from a political stance, not feel or some sort of veneer of political belief, but actual principles that underline what you do. Do you believe in equity, fairness, leaving no one in our society behind? Or are you okay with the inequalities that we have? They're just the consequence of the rampant free market, and you've got to have losers. Are you okay with where wealth is concentrated in some rather than others? Those are the principles that we need to talk about on this island, because those are the principles that many people would really engage with. And this piece of bureaucracy will not do that. Because from different sides of the political spectrum, sir, I could write something to cover this, and then it's fine. That's fine by me. There's my view. It could be disagreed with, but there's no accountability for the document. The document itself that will have to be produced, as was mentioned before by civil servants, there's no accountability as to whether you've actually got that. This is a nod to some form of accountability in our politics that simply isn't there at the moment. So I would finish, sir, by saying the way forward here is for people to talk to their colleagues that they're going to be elected with, form a genuine political party, register yourself in the courts so that you are accountable, including your finances and who's backing you and who's paying for your campaigns, and then be honest about your politics as you go out to the electorate. That's the way forward. And when we don't do that, no manner of bureaucratic processes or form filling or box ticking, very difficult to say, sir, box ticking will solve the problems that we have in our politics. So let's look forward to the next election, that transparency and the openness of our politics. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Howard.
Thank you, sir. I'm not a member of any political party, but I do agree that we all have a duty to future generations, and we can all sign up to A, B, C, D, and E. But I do not think we should do so, sir. This would be a law. This would be more thick treacle for us to have to go through. And I don't think that's how we should be running our States Assembly. And I urge you to vote against this proposition. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. Does anyone else wish to speak on this proposition? I call upon Deputy Wilson to reply. Deputy Wilson.
Thank you, sir. To be quite honest, I didn't expect as varied and as interesting a debate. So thank you to those who have been engaged with it. There are clearly a couple of points that people wanted addressing in my summing up. And I just thought I would respect that by taking each one of those, if I might, in turn. I think the first thing I just want to say is that despite the assertions about this being a piece of bureaucracy, yes, it is a law, but it's a law that is like no other in the sense that it will, if adopted, if we choose to go there, would fundamentally address the way in which we go about our governance and also the way in which we account to the public. And from what we see based on the information that we are getting from independent audit is that we are not joined up, we are inconsistent in the way we deliver things, and that, just those two things, are costing islanders money. And it's also costing us in reputation as well, because the issues about how governments make decisions or how parliaments make decisions is a really important issue to voters. And what they want is governments to be able to balance both short-term and long-term thinking when they're making decisions about things that affect their lives. So I don't subscribe to the Chief Minister's view that it's too difficult and it's bureaucratic and there isn't any need for this to be done. Deputy Miles, I thank her for her contribution, and the things that resonated with me in terms of what she was saying was about the fact that we are not consistently using outcomes as a guide to make better decisions. And my question is, why not? And I don't think anybody's answered that this morning at all, but it's a question that we do need an answer to. I have a view myself, and I think that's because we are completely focused on task and we're focused on process. And I don't believe that the current arrangements that we have in place at the moment provide sufficient time or discipline for us to consider and imagine what impact our decisions are having going forward. She also talked about the importance of embedding things, and that's a really important concept in future generations thinking, because it's not just about saying what you're going to do, it's about just demonstrating how you're actually doing it and what you're actually building in terms of your systems to make sure that those things stick. Deputy Tadia also talked about bringing the issues like cost of living into focus, and the important point that we're now in a position where we found ourselves in a crisis. And did any of us ever see that coming? And can we be sure that what we were doing 10 years ago was preparing us for this moment? It's an important question, and I think that's the other thing that really the future generations thinking law would enable us to do, is to create scenarios that allow us to model and plan in a way that we're not doing at the moment. He wanted to ask me, or he asked me about the issues around how we use the human rights impact and the CREA impact assessments. And to be quite honest, I think, yes, they are seen, in my view, as really important things to do. But I think they could play a part in a wider assessment of what impact we're having in the round, not just in relation to a human rights perspective or a children's rights perspective, but we could start to look at the systems that would actually take into consideration the more broader impact of the policies that we're making across a whole set of dimensions without actually adding any further burden around that process. He talked about the tensions between the environmental impact and the economy. And I can't see anywhere at the moment in terms of our plans or our ways of working that we're squaring this, that we're actually getting the balance that we need. The importance of integration and collaboration and a shared purpose is really important. And what I think he's highlighted is that there is a question to be asked about how we design the things that we are trying to put in place. Have we got the right design around our policies and our systems and our structures? And the law, if we were to look at it and to start to do some work on it, would help us to design some of the ways in which we become more collaborative, more purposeful, more integrated, and really understand the impact of what we're trying to achieve. Deputy Doublé talked about the benefits that had been received or seen in the approach to the CREA. And one of the things that I think she talked very much about, again, like Deputy Miles, was this importance of embedding something. and that what we need to be doing is creating the stepping stones towards getting much better decision-making processes underway. I can't agree with Deputy Miller. This just isn't a process. This is more than that. This is about values. This is about leadership. And this is about the way in which a modern government could operate and whether or not we're brave enough to actually go there and have a look at what we can change. And it does make me question that if everything in the garden is rosy, why are we receiving information from the independent audits that tells us that we're carrying huge risks, we're inefficient, and that we are not planning effectively for the future. So the reason I'm sort of trying to engage people in the debate is because it's not true that everything is working well. It is the case that we've got real problems, that we are not lifting our heads up and looking to see what other ways are there that we can tackle this. Deputy Renouf provided some really interesting perspectives on the impact of not working properly as a government and what that means in terms of people's confidence in politics. And I quite like the example that he gave in relation to the person around Brexit and economic growth. And I think what he shows, or he's shown through that example, is that he's quite right. We've got to start thinking about what society do we think we need to have in place, and what's that going to look like? I think there are some people who don't see parts of society and the issues and the concerns that some islanders feel, and so they don't have the worldview perhaps that maybe a future generation's approach like this would bring. He talked about being imaginative and creative response to the situation that we face in relation to, islanders not having faith in government, not believing that government is listening to what's important in their lives. And I think if we were to engage people in a lawful framework that actually requires us to talk to them more, to listen to them more, and I accept there are ways in which parties will engage their membership, but this is much more about just being a member of a political party. The other comments, if I could pick up on in relation to Deputy Mezek, I liked his husting speech. I thought that was quite appropriate, given this is his last moment to speak. But I'm going to take the word vibe. I do think we need to create a new vibe in our politics. I think we need to start getting really excited about what we can do to actually create a different kind of future for people. And that's not only about the way we deliver, but it's about the way we lead and the values that we will carry going forward. Deputy Kovac, I thank her for her contribution. She referenced the importance of the FPP reports, and what I think we're struggling with is what are the tangible solutions to how we deal with some of the pressures and some of the burdens that the FPP have highlighted that we're having to address. And I do think that it's insufficient for us to sit down and talk about it and make a commitment. I think the message that's coming loud and clear in this is that we all do that, but we are not actually demonstrating that we are actually delivering and doing that, and we're not evidencing and we're not seeing the outcomes that tell us that we are. Deputy Stevenson talked about, you know, we need a radical way forward, and I agree with her. I think the metaphor of leaving, you know, your dress in a good state, I think is an important one to do. I feel very responsible, having been here for the last 4 years. I think I've done my best. I think I've tried to do as much as I can within the constraints that I had, as most will probably agree with in relation to their own roles. But I think what we've missed here is a collective responsibility to actually deliver a kind of result for Islanders at the end of this term that I would have liked to have seen. And for that, I think we've missed an opportunity, which I think if we had a law like this, it would actually help and support us. So I think I've managed to cover everybody's comments. I'm not expecting that the proposition will be wholly supported. Sorry, I meant to mention Deputy Gardner's and Deputy Feltham's commentary as well. My apologies for that. I think Deputy Gardner talked about the really important thing about us trying to guard against one department delivering on an outcome at the expense of another who then has a problem delivering on their outcomes. I think that's a really astute observation about the state of the sort of chaos that ensues when we're not actually working in an integrative and collaborative way. And Deputy Feltham wanted to know why I didn't bring this proposition earlier. 2 reasons, really. I think because a number of people that I'd spoken to were a bit hesitant about whether or not a law would be the right way forward. But I spoke to Jane Davidson, who's the architect of the Future Wales law. And one of the things that she said is there's never a right moment to introduce this. It sets a marker for the future. It will actually get people thinking about what have we done, what haven't we done, what could we have done. And I hope that, having had the debate today, this leaves members with a thought that we can't carry on the way we are. We do need to change, in some ways, what we're trying to achieve so that we can demonstrate that the purpose of our intention and the impact of that intention will endure for longer term and for future generations. And I'll leave it there, Sarah, and I'll call for the appel. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. The appel has been called for. Members are invited to return to their seats. I'll ask the greffier to open the voting. All members have the opportunity of casting their votes. I ask the greffier to close the voting. I can announce the proposition has been rejected. 12 votes for, 32 votes contre. Yes.
Those voting for the Conotub of St Lawrence and online the Conotub of St Clement, and deputies Dublé, Morale, Gardner, War, Miles, Renouf, Jearn, Wilson, Stevenson and Andrews.
I'll move on to Channel Islands Lottery Distributions of Proceeds 2026. I ask the greffier to read the proposition.
The states are asked to decide whether they are of opinion to agree, in accordance with the provisions of Regulation 4(5) of the Gambling Channel Islands Lottery Jersey Regulations 1975, to allocate $1,130,000 to the Jersey Community Foundation, the Association of Jersey Charities, and Jersey Sport for onward distribution in support of the island community. The allocation is to be as follows: 50% to the Association of Jersey Charities, 565,000 solely for charities; 30,000 to the Jersey Community Foundation, 339,000 to be split between arts, culture and heritage, 65 to 75%, and applied science or applied research in the fields of engineering, biology, physics, chemistry or mathematics, provided that the funds are either to be used locally or for the direct benefit of Jersey, including any education from which locals may benefit, 25 to 35%, and 20% to Jersey Sport, 226,000 for sports and active lifestyles.
Minister.
Thank you, sir. Deputy Malcolm Ferry will be taking this as rapporteur.
Yes, Deputy Ferry.
Thank you, sir. I thank members for agreeing that this proposition is debated using a truncated lodging period, as will allow us to consider the lottery proceeds before the summer recess and to allow these funds to be distributed as soon as possible if passed. As members will be aware, the proposition is brought to the State Assembly every year, as it is the responsibility of the Assembly to approve the distribution of proceeds from the Channel Island Lottery. I'm very happy to report that this year's total for the distribution is the highest we've seen in half a decade, at 1,130,000. Members will be aware that last year this Assembly approved a slight change on how the proceeds were to be split to distribute the funds three ways between the Association of Jersey Charities, Jersey Community Foundation and Jersey Sport. This was in line with the recommendation of the 2023 Review of Sport and Physical Activity and done with the consent of both the Jersey Community Foundation and Jersey Sport. This replaced the previous 50-50 split between the Association of Jersey Charities and the Jersey Community Foundation, whereby the Jersey Community Foundation allocation was subdivided between arts, culture and heritage, applied sciences or research and sport. This year we're therefore proposing to continue with this allocation with 50% of the proceeds going to the Association of Jersey Charities for distribution to local charities, 20% going to Jersey Sport to support local sporting associations, and 30% going to the Jersey Community Foundation. As with previous years, each distributing entity will have a service level agreement with government to ensure proper oversight and reporting, as well as regular meetings with ministers and officers. Finally, I'd like to recognise the excellent work done by our local charitable sector and by the Association of Jersey Charities and the Jersey Community Foundation. Their work supports a huge range of good causes and makes a much valued impact upon our community. Sir, I make the proposition.
Thank you, Deputy. Is the proposition seconded? Yes, sir. Thank you. Does anyone wish to speak on the proposition? Yes, Dr. Tillier.
Thanks, sir. Just have some very short comments to make. So the scrutiny panel, our scrutiny panel has issued very brief comments on this. We note that this basically mirrors what happened last year in terms of the division of funds, which the rapporteurs quite clearly laid out in terms of the split. The panel is quite happy to support the proposition based on the fact that it remains the same as last year. That's where the panel comments end. If I could just prefer a couple of personal comments to this. I think what we're seeing now, because this is a very formulaic way of things happening, I do question whether this needs to come to the Assembly in future and whether actually we should look at the way in which the lottery legislation works, because this isn't government money, this isn't taxpayers' money that we're distributing here. This is effectively an opt-in lottery scheme where members of the public decide that they want to have a little flutter, and they do that on the basis that they may win something. It's not the best way to make money, by the way, if you're doing it purely from a speculative point of view. There are more sure investments, although you do know, I think, roughly what you're likely to get back in terms of your expectancy when gambling. But of course, I think they do that in the full knowledge that the profits that are made will be going to good causes in the island, and I think that probably is part of the reason also that people like to game in this way. But I don't see why why government's got any role to play in this apart from in the issuing of a licence for a lottery. As I've said, it's not our money. The money which is given freely by members of the public, possibly even tourists, but generally, I suppose, locals. And that is effectively a contract really between them and the lottery operators, and the beneficiaries are all of these good causes. So I would be interested in maybe the rapporteur can comment on that in future, whether he sees, because we do hear about red tape, we hear about the Assembly streamlining its business, and what he thinks the justification is now in 2026 for, I get there needs to be oversight, but that can happen by the Gambling Commission, presumably. I think that's one thing that they can still do. They haven't been given another job this year that they might have been given, and why government and this Assembly needs to directly oversee and redistribute these proceeds every year. So, thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. Does anyone else wish to speak on the proposition? Deputy Dooley.
Just briefly, sir, and I wonder if the Minister knows about this, but members may recall that Jersey Sport, there was a move to cancel the toddler sessions that were being provided, I think through the Move More scheme, and after some discussions between myself and the Chief Minister, and I know others were advocating for this, there was some funding found, but I think it was for 2 years. I'm unsure as to whether this funding, which this year additionally to Jersey Sport, does the Minister, is there anything attached to that, and does the Minister know anything about those sessions, because I know they're of great importance to the children themselves in their early years, but certainly to parents.
Thank you, Deputy. Does anyone else wish to speak on this proposition? No one else wishes to speak. I call upon Deputy Ferry to reply. Deputy Ferry.
Thank you, sir. And I thank two members for their contributions. Firstly, in relation to Deputy Tadia, thank you for your comments. I think, you know, this is something which has kind of grown up organically, and it's always a good time to see if we can smooth the processes and make them more streamlined. So that is something that we'll certainly take away and reconsider. In relation to Deputy Doublet's comments, yes, I remember that at the time funding was sought from the pilot fund, I believe, and that was a kind of short-term stopgap, and we are really keen to ensure that that function continues, because we understand the value of children of that age being able to access Move More, and the toddler facility it is very much valued. So I'm sure we will find a way forward to continue funding that. I would just like to say that having run two small charities, I understand the value of this funding. You know, it's in the big scheme of things, it's not a huge sum of money. There are some charities, some bigger charities that could scoop this up quite easily, but particularly smaller charities, they are the ones that benefit most, and also particularly charities that are seeking core funding. Because while there's lots of philanthropists who will happily sponsor projects, they're usually not so keen to sponsor core funding in terms of staff salaries, because they don't want a dependency to form. And both the Jersey Community Foundation and the Association of Jersey Charities are two of the few organisations that will sponsor core funding, sometimes up to 3 years, which gives charities a bit of surety and a bit of security for their staff. So I hope members will support this proposition, sir, and I call for the appeal.
As has been called for, members are invited to return to their seats. I ask the greffier to open the voting. If all members have the opportunity of casting their votes, I ask the greffier to close the voting. Proposition has been adopted unanimously, 45 votes for. The next item is deferral of land transaction, Philip Lefevre House and Huguenot House, lodged by Deputy Wall. The main respondent is the Minister for Infrastructure. I ask the greffier to read the proposition.
The States are asked to decide whether they are of opinion to request the Minister for Infrastructure to defer approval of the land transaction agreement as proposed in R43 of 2026, presented to the States on 18th of March 2026, pending consideration by the next States Assembly of a feasibility report and cost-benefit analysis subsequent to an investigation of alternatives uses of the site to include the options of using the site to provide open space and public parking.
Deputy Ward.
Thank you, sir. And I'd like to just start by saying that I do not take lightly the impact of further delay on the sale of this site. Philip Lefevre House and Huguenot House have remained empty for far too long. But that period of vacancy could and should have been used to understand the needs of St Helier and how this site in particular could be optimally developed for the public good. My fear is that of the Connétable of St Helier is that we are drifting towards yet more town cramming rather than recognising the wider utility this site could offer our community. A flog and forget approach to publicly owned, strategically located assets is surely unacceptable. Once it is gone forever. And we will not get another opportunity like this in the heart of our town. So the financial return on this site is important. Of course it is, but it cannot be the only measure we use. Not when we are dealing with a site that unlocks genuine community opportunities. Not when we are dealing with a site that could not only serve the economy, but also the health, well-being, and culture of this island, in ways that private development simply will not deliver. I've already advocated for this site to be used as a temporary school whilst we refurbish the school estate in St Helier. That idea received short shrift in this assembly, but the need has not gone away. And so I rise today to remind members that this is our last opportunity to determine how we want this significant site to be used. Once it is sold, any investor will understandably seek to maximise their return. And in the centre of St Helier, that usually means land banking followed by more 1- and 2-bedroom apartments. If you don't believe me, look at Les Sablons and the old Apollo Hotel site. Is that truly the outcome that meets the needs of our society today, or can we do a whole lot better? But, sir, there is another dimension to this debate, one that we cannot ignore. I was reminded of this in an email that was sent to me by Simon Ward, a BBC reporter, whose great-uncle was Philip Lefevre, one of our great visionary politicians. I remind members that this building carries the name of Senator Philip Lefevre, a towering figure in the history of this island. He was one of the first senators elected to by the people of Jersey, and he fought one of the most bruising political battles of the 20th century to introduce social security. He faced organised opposition, public hostility, and even physical intimidation. He lost his presidency of the Jersey Farmers Union on the very day the Social Security scheme came into force. But he delivered a reform that has supported generations of islanders and continues to do so today. His name on this building is not decorative, it's not incidental, it is a reminder of the values he stood for: fairness, dignity, and the belief that government should serve the well-being of its people. So when we debate the future of Philip Lefevre House, we're not simply debating a property transaction, we are deciding whether we treat this site and the legacy attached to it with intention or indifference. This isn't simply about a financial balance sheet transaction, this is a community balance sheet matter, balancing the needs of all of our community. If the building is to change, then we must ensure that his contribution is not quietly erased. We must ensure that the site is used in a way that reflects the values he fought for, rather than reduced to the narrow logic of short-term financial gain. And in that vein, I'd like to put forward my own thoughts about pragmatic solution, what a pragmatic solution looks like. In the first instance, the Infrastructure Department, I suggest, talks to Andium and the Treasurer to raise the £2.5 million to purchase the site. We've already seen the willingness of the Treasurer to reduce the annual return that Andium make to government over the purchase of the Gas Place site, so why not do the same on this site? I'm sure Deputy Mezek, who's been a huge critic of the Andium return over the years, would be only too happy as a town deputy to support such an approach. Deputy Ward has been a great advocate of pocket parks. Well, here's a great opportunity to not only provide a much-needed pocket park, but also great play facilities. Who knows, we might even end up with an implementable play strategy for the whole of St Helier. We only have to look at the parade to see the impact on our community of a well-designed and properly funded play offer. As someone who also recognises that dumping a load of cost onto government isn't a smart thing to do in an era when we need to watch every penny spent, the development of an underground car park on the site would not only generate much needed revenue to pay for the ongoing maintenance of the site, but would also massively benefit traders in town as their customers have easier access to St Helier. An affordable, sustainable solution that recognises that nothing is free anymore. This is about cooperation, collaboration between government departments, the parish, and our community, and is something I fervently believe is the way St Helier will work in the future. Let's grasp this incredible opportunity whilst we still can. Let's put St Helier first in such a way that not only benefits her residents and traders, but also makes our capital more accessible to all islanders, rather than continuing with, and to quote Deputy Rob Ward, managed decline. I asked members to support my proposition.
Thank you, Deputy Ward. Is the proposition seconded?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, sir. I'm sure, in his words, my favourite deputy has brought this proposition in good faith. Nevertheless, this is a disappointing proposition, and I ask members to reject it. It's disappointing, sir, because it seeks to delay the sale of an empty state property, something we are repeatedly criticised for, and not that long ago we had a housing minister who would have actually put a note on our door. It's disappointing because it takes no account of the long and thorough process that both officers and ministers have been through to reach this stage, and the good value we have achieved for the site. It is disappointing, sir, because it was lodged without any prior engagement with ministers, despite an offer for a briefing made. So I mentioned last week that I had seen 1,039 people at my drop-ins, and that is 1,038 plus the mover of this proposition, so he knows where I am and when he can get hold of me. Sir, I do take issue with various aspects of Deputy Ward's report to the proposition. Firstly, I do not accept Deputy Ward's claim that this transaction is being rushed through. That is incorrect, sir. This process began in 2024 when the site was first marketed externally. A sale wasn't completed on that occasion, sir, because after discussions it became clear that the health department saw a need to retain the facility known as the diner, which meant that 38 Lamott Street would need to be withdrawn from sale. I am pleased that the Deputy refers to mental health and the challenges we face. This is exactly the reason for retaining the Lamott Street building, so we can continue to provide and enhance the services offered to clients there. The siting of Lamott Street being excellent in as much as it is in town, but not in the heart of town, offering clients a degree of confidentiality. Such an approach, where considerations such as this are duly accommodated, is hardly rushing things through, and indeed is evidence of a balanced and measured approach. If you speak to my colleague, the Minister of Social Security, and the person responsible for the fund that owns the facility, I don't think she would say that this has been rushed. In fact, she would say the opposite. The Minister confirmed on the 24th of February, in answer to a question from Deputy Wall, I have had many conversations with ministers over the past year, something I'm happy to confirm, sir. There were also other considerations and possible options for the future use of the site. The Regeneration Steering Group has taken the time to consider all of those options, from a park, a car park, housing and assisted living. There have inevitably been several issues and priorities to balance. As we say in the comments paper, ministers have had regard to the overall cost and viability of the site. In future, ongoing revenue and maintenance, policies set out in the current island plan, delivering value to the Social Security Fund, community well-being, placemaking in the public realm, green space, traffic safety and congestion, and the long-term needs of the community. When you look around the Regeneration Steering Group table, sir, St Helier is well represented with members who understand what St Helier needs, including the Connétable St Helier, who fights for what St Helier needs, but who also work constructively and practically, recognising what we need to achieve a balance across the town. As well as delivering more housing, the government has plans for new and modern youth and educational facilities in town, an improved public realm, more parks and a greener St Helier. One thing that most people know for certain, though, is that more delay and more empty properties is exactly what St Helier doesn't need. So in terms of parking and public parking facilities, which also falls in my brief, I fully support the provision of additional parking on the outskirts of St Helier. Indeed, we provided a fantastic facility in Charles Street that receives positive feedback from its users. So that is why we looked extensively at Lamotte Street as a potential car park. We have identified several sites, some in government ownership, some in parish ownership and private ownership, all offering significantly more spaces than this site and, importantly, much better access and egress. As I've mentioned, the Lamotte Street site was seriously considered for parking but ruled out due to the viability of the site, including that access and egress. In terms of people accessing retail and services in town, which the Deputy talks about in his report, I remind the Deputy and members that we've seen significant increase in ridership of the Hopper bus, with ridership numbers now double what they were when we came into office just over 2 years ago. We have also significantly improved the disabled parking offering, and work continues in this area. As infrastructure, I have consistently supported more active travel routes in St Helier and to and from St Helier. We have provided more cycle parking, including covered parking, more green space and improved public realm, supporting both our retail and visitor strategies, even in the face of some strong opposition. I do so because I believe this is the long-term best interests of St Helier and the island, not just looking at short-term electoral prospects. Members may be interested to note, sir, the proposal for a park resulted from an offer of £1 from one party. I'm not sure if that is a return which ministers would have been overly commended for accepting, given the responsibility we also have to the Social Security Fund. Sir, it is just a 2 or 3 minute walk from this site in Columbury to our wonderful Howe Davis Park. A park, sir, estimated to cost between £8 and £10 million, and then you have to maintain it, sir. So following the detailed deliberations that I've referenced, Philip Lefevre House and Huguenot House were marketed again earlier this year. It is worth noting on both occasions the properties were marketed independently by external agencies. Indeed, 2 agencies, sir, because a former senior employee of Jersey Property Holdings had moved to work for our original provider, and I was concerned at perceptions of any conflict of interest. Having considered the bids received, a recommendation was made and presented through a Standing Order 168 report as per due process. That is what is required, sir, by standing orders, a 15 working day notice period. So the idea that a process which started in 2024 is one that has been rushed as we stand here at the end of March 2026 is one that escapes me. It is also worth noting, sir, that in terms of value, the highest of the original bids we received for the whole site, including 38 Lamont Street, was 2.9 million for a site of 4,275 square metres. The bid of 2.3 million for the reduced site of 2,335 square metres, I believe, my officers believe, and the independent experienced local agents also agreed was a good deal for the public of the island. Looking at the prices on a square metre basis, the original bid for the whole site at £678 per square metre for the larger area, and the bid we have accepted is £985 per square metre. Or another way, the per square metre price is now some 45% higher. Yes, sir, 45% higher than the original site. The original site did have listed areas which would have increased the development costs. I do share the Deputy's concern about town cramming, hence my previous decisions on public realm. It should also be noted that we did receive a higher bid than the one we accepted. The reason for turning that down was it was subject to conditions, including receiving planning permission for 40,000 square foot of residential properties. This was felt to be too much and unrealistic for the site by both officers and the independent agent. And given the conditions attached to the higher bid, the potential receipts may have actually ended up lower than the 2.3 million had planning approved a lower square footage of residential accommodation and may not have been realised for a long time. The sum we have accepted should allow sufficient green space to be provided in any scheme that is put forward. As I've said, we have always had a balance in mind. Recent suggestions for the sites, including reciting the ALOs under one roof. Well, sir, consolidating our ALOs is something I can get behind, albeit this site isn't suitable. Most members won't know that in 2018, when I was the chair of Jersey Business, I approached ministers of the day with exactly that suggestion. I firmly believed then, as I do now, that there are efficiencies, not just in property, but in finance, HR, IT and marketing. The reality, sir, is that the site belongs to a fund, so a commercial rent would have to be paid. There would need to be significant investment, and given the different leases that the ALOs have, it could take many years to get them under one roof. So Jubilee Wharf is an example of a state-owned building that we have retained with a view to putting our regulatory bodies under one roof. Easy to say, but difficult in practice. Again, they have many leases, but we are making steady progress. The Deputy refers to too many 1 and 2 bed properties on the market. Well, sir, market forces will dictate what the developer provides, as there is no point in providing a product to a market that is already saturated. I think what alarms me most about this proposition is the lack of a thought-through alternative. It is simply asking ministers to repeat a process that we have already been through. There is no clear proposal from Deputy Wall. The Deputy says he wants to find the space to have a discussion around how we optimise the value of this key site in town, sir. This government has found that space and has had those detailed discussions. The choice now is between delivery and delay. Deputy Wall spoke earlier today about judgment. Throughout my time as Infrastructure Minister, I have tried to get on with things, assess the information available to me, and make a decision based on that information. So, we heard about Philip Lefevre. Social Security, sir, is not being changed. In fact, a picture of Philip Lefevre hangs in the building in Union Street, and I'm sure we could have a conversation with the people who have purchased the site to honour that name in the future. We have to go forward, sir, and I would suggest that the Deputy appears to favour delay. I favour delivery, and I hope members will reject the proposition. Thank you, sir.
Minister.
Chairman, sir.
Members content to adjourn? Adjourn until 2 o'clock.